Welcome to Midnight History, where the forgotten truths of the past come to life. Have you ever heard of the profession of bounty hunter? A passionate, adventurous profession constantly pursuing both justice and money, fame on screen. Yes, in the world of cinema, bounty hunters are often imagined as daring, heroic figures, effortlessly chasing down criminals, always just one step ahead, with rewards waiting at the end. We picture them as lone wanderers, much like knights or mercenaries, with a code of honor, ever ready to fight for justice, or perhaps for treasure. The image is captivating, a mix of bravery and mystery. But, as with many tales from the past, the truth is a little less glamorous. In reality, medieval bounty hunters were not the charming heroes we see on screen. Their lives were dangerous, filled with hardship and uncertainty, driven more by survival than by the ideals of chivalry or honor. They lived on the edge, often without the praise or rewards they dreamed of. The truth behind their work, which we'll explore, is much more complex and far darker than the legends we've come to know. So, before you drift off to sleep, let's explore the naked truth behind the profession of bounty hunter. And if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so we have more motivation to produce better quality products. Chapter 1. The unofficial yet crucial role of medieval bounty hunters. In the medieval period, the role of a bounty hunter was not one officially recognized by the state. It was an occupation that existed in the margins, a necessity born out of society that often lacked the resources, infrastructure, or even the desire to maintain an efficient legal system. There were no modern police forces, no criminal databases, no organized systems of law enforcement as we know them today. In this fragmented world, where villages, towns, and kingdoms operated with varying degrees of autonomy, the profession of bounty hunting became an essential, albeit unofficial, part of the medieval landscape. This wasn't a job anyone would apply for at a well-lit office desk or after completing any formal education. Bounty hunters were often self-appointed individuals, men who found themselves either drawn to the dangerous life for personal reasons or compelled by the harsh economic realities of time. Their services were often required after a crime was committed and the authorities were either unwilling or unable to catch the criminals responsible. This was especially true in periods of war, unrest, or after rebellions, when the breakdown of law and order created a vacuum that bounty hunters could fill. Despite the absence of official recognition, bounty hunters held power, and their work was critical in keeping order in a society that was often teetering on the brink of chaos. They were tasked with bringing fugitives to justice, whether those fugitives were common thieves or high-ranking traitors. In this context, bounty hunting became something more than just a job. It was a service to both the public and the elite, an occupation that allowed the powerful to protect their wealth, land, and influence. The profession of bounty hunting, much like the medieval justice system itself, was based on a loose and sometimes dubious sense of authority. Medieval law was not as centralized or uniform as we might imagine today. While monarchs, lords, and religious institutions had their own forms of power, the application of justice was often fragmented and inconsistent. Feudal systems often resulted in regions where local lords could rule almost autonomously, applying their own brand of justice according to personal preference, family ties, or even bribery. With such irregularity in the enforcement of laws, bounty hunters often found themselves operating outside of the formal systems, working as independent agents in a world that operated on a mix of coercion, trust, and necessity. One might think of bounty hunters in medieval times as the precursors to modern-day mercenaries or even private detectives, working on the fringes of law enforcement. However, while mercenaries are often hired to fight wars and private detectives are hired to investigate crimes, bounty hunters had one specific goal: to track down individuals who have been accused of serious crimes or who had fled justice. In many ways, they were both judge and executioner, working outside of official institutions, and sometimes resorting to ruthless methods to get their jobs done. Their work was driven by the rewards offered for capturing or killing these criminals. These rewards were sometimes substantial, depending on the crime, the person in question, and the social status of the person being pursued. The more dangerous the fugitive, the higher the reward. However, despite the potential for wealth, the job came with a heavy price. For bounty hunters, The line between doing something morally justified and crossing into villainy was often blurred. After all, they weren't concerned with the intricacies of justice or the nuances of the law. They were focused on one thing: the capture of their target. Consider the nature of the crimes that bounty hunters were often tasked with investigating: murder, treason, theft, and rebellion. In a medieval society, where politics were as deadly as swords and where an accusation of treason could lead to execution, bounty hunters operated as both an instrument of the law and an agent of fear. A successful bounty hunter's reputation was built on both their efficiency and their brutality. After all, a bounty hunter who was known for tracking down criminals quickly and effectively was one who had a solid grip on their business. However, a bounty hunter who was too soft, who gave their target a chance to escape or fight back, was one who would soon find themselves without work. This unofficial status of bounty hunters also meant that there was a constant struggle between them and the formal authorities, whether they were local lords, the monarchy, or the church. Often, bounty hunters were seen as being on the periphery of society, neither truly accepted nor fully rejected by the powers that be. Some lords even used bounty hunters to do their dirty work, sending them after troublesome peasants or rebellious factions, while others viewed them with suspicion, seeing them as potential threats to their own power and order. Despite the often grim nature of their work, bounty hunters had an undeniable impact on medieval society. Their presence helped fill the gaps left by official law enforcement and provided a method of handling crime in a society that often lacked the infrastructure to do so. In many ways, the rise of bounty hunting reflected the political and social instability of the time. Bounty hunters operated not only in the shadows of the law, but also in the darker corners of the medieval political landscape, where social unrest, feuds, and corruption were rampant. Moreover, the fact that bounty hunting was not officially sanctioned often made it more effective. In a world where justice was slow, incomplete, or uneven, bounty hunters could act swiftly and decisively. They could pursue their targets across great distances, infiltrating enemy territories or dangerous regions where local law enforcement would never dare to go. The boundaries of their jurisdiction were often undefined, allowing them to operate as they saw fit. They could go into enemy camps, infiltrate dangerous fortresses, or hunt down criminals in faraway lands, doing what the authorities could not or would not do. But this unregulated freedom also carried with it immense dangers. Bounty hunters had no formal protection. They were not knights sworn to uphold honor, nor were they soldiers under the banner of an army with rules and codes. Their only protection was their skill, cunning, and ruthlessness. They lived at the mercy of both the criminals they hunted and the authorities who viewed them as little more than hired guns. In a time when life was often brutal and fleeting, bounty hunters lived on the edge, always in danger of falling victim to the very same violence they dispensed. As a result, the profession became a paradox. On one hand, bounty hunters were heroes, acting in the service of the law or powerful individuals. On the other hand, they were often seen as merciless predators, living outside the law and pushing the boundaries of morality. They were both celebrated and vilified, depending on the outcome of their efforts. Success brought wealth and admiration. Failure brought shame, injury, and death. It was a profession filled with contradictions, where the line between good and evil was often difficult to discern. In the medieval world, bounty hunters were not only tasked with tracking down criminals, but they were also lured into their dangerous line of work by the possibility of substantial rewards. Unlike modern law enforcement officers, who are typically salaried or government employed, medieval bounty hunters operated on the promise of wealth and property. They worked on commission, their compensation tied directly to their success in capturing or killing fugitives. For those who excelled in their craft, this arrangement offered potential for immense fortune, making bounty hunting a highly attractive profession. Despite the inherent risks, the rewards themselves could vary widely depending on the gravity of the crime committed by the target. If the fugitive was a high-profile figure, such as a nobleman accused of treason or a notorious criminal, the bounty placed on their head could be enormous. On the other hand, if the criminal was a lesser-known individual, the reward might be considerably smaller. However, these sums were not merely pocket change. In the context of a medieval economy, where wealth was often tied to land or livestock, a bounty hunter's pay could transform their social standing and provide them with opportunities that were otherwise out of reach. One of the most common forms of payment for a successful bounty hunter was land. Feudal societies were structured around land ownership, and land was often the most valuable asset one could possess. In certain cases, a nobleman or a wealthy lord might offer a parcel of land to a bounty hunter in exchange for the capture of a fugitive. This was an especially attractive reward, as land provided not only a source of wealth through agriculture and the ability to raise livestock, but also status within the community. By acquiring land, bounty hunters could rise in social rank, gaining the respect of their peers and the right to establish a place for themselves in a world that often marginalized the lower classes. But land wasn't the only form of payment. Some bounty hunters were paid in coin, gold or silver, directly representing tangible wealth. The allure of this cash payment could be irresistible, especially for those living in poverty or struggling to survive in the medieval world. The prospect of receiving a significant sum of money for a successful capture was enough to drive many individuals into the perilous profession. The money could be used to pay off debts, support a family, or even fund the acquisition of armor or weapons, further enhancing the bounty hunter's abilities and status. Nobles, lords, and kings often used bounties as a way to exert control over a region. In times of war or political unrest, bounty hunters were sometimes enlisted to hunt down deserters, traitors, or rebellious figures. The rewards offered were not just a simple financial transaction. They were also a demonstration of power and authority. A lord who offered a large reward for the capture of a fugitive could show his dominance over both the criminals and his subjects, asserting his control over his territory. At the same time, it served as a warning to anyone else who might consider defying his rule. Disobedience would be met with swift and punitive action, enforced not by the traditional legal systems, but by individuals with their own code and agenda. Interestingly, bounty hunters were often paid in a mixture of tangible rewards and promises of future favors. This practice made the reward system even more enticing. A noble might promise a bounty hunter not only a cash reward or land, but also future commissions or the opportunity to join the lord's personal retinue. In some cases, bounty hunters might even receive political leverage, an endorsement that could open doors for other lucrative opportunities. Such promises, when coupled with the material rewards of land or money, added an additional layer of motivation to the profession. Despite the attractive nature of these rewards, it's important to recognize that bounty hunting was not without its moral and personal costs. The very act of hunting down and capturing criminals or fugitives was dangerous, and bounty hunters had to contend with the very real threat of harm. They faced the risk of being killed or injured in the process, and some bounty hunters were known to be wounded in the line of duty, sometimes fatally. Additionally, bounty hunters often had to travel far and wide to pursue their targets, which meant long, arduous journeys through hostile territories, dense forests, or even foreign lands. The rewards, while lucrative, did not come easily. Bounty hunters had to possess a combination of skills that were not common to most people. Tracking, ambush tactics, combat skills, and even negotiation were all part of a bounty hunter's skill set. The ability to survive in harsh conditions, whether in the wilderness or in the midst of a bustling town, was equally important. Bounty hunters had to be resourceful and cunning, able to outsmart their targets and evade the authorities who might also be looking for the same criminals. Moreover, the rewards themselves were not always guaranteed. A bounty hunter's success was often determined by the conditions in which they worked. A fugitive on the run might be difficult to track, particularly if they were able to blend into a different social or geographical context. A bounty hunter could spend days, weeks, or even months tracking down a criminal, only to find that the fugitive had escaped or was killed before the hunter could reach them. The risk of failure and the lack of guaranteed compensation was ever present. Some bounty hunters became famous because of the large sums they earned, creating legends that endured long after their deaths. Their success stories were recounted in folk tales and songs, where they were immortalized as figures of resilience and bravery. However, these stories often omitted the darker sides of their profession. For every bounty hunter who achieved wealth and status, there were many others who lived and died in obscurity, their names lost to history. In the end, the reward for a successful bounty hunter was not just monetary. It was often a fleeting moment of fame, a brief period of elevated social status, and the satisfaction of knowing that they had survived another dangerous mission. The real irony of bounty hunting in the medieval period lies in the paradox between the rewards and the dangers. On one hand, bounty hunters had the opportunity to gain wealth, status, and land, but on the other hand, they faced dangers at every turn. Even if they succeeded in their mission, they might be betrayed by their employers, rejected by society, or killed in an ambush. The rewards were alluring, but they were often tied to a life that was anything but secure. In many ways, the rewards of bounty hunting reflected the broader values of medieval society. Wealth and power were the ultimate goals, and those who sought them often had to navigate a world where morality and survival were at odds. Bounty hunters, like many others in the medieval world, had to make hard choices. For some, the promise of reward was enough to justify the risks. For others, it was the only path to survival. In the perilous world of medieval bounty hunting, the rewards were not just financial or material. They extended into the realm of social status, power, and personal legacy. The rewards promised of bounty hunters for capturing fugitives, criminals, or traitors were often larger than life. But beyond the gold coins and parcels of land, there were deeper, more intangible rewards that motivated many to take on a dangerous and uncertain profession. While the public perception of bounty hunters tend to focus on the monetary rewards and the potential for wealth, the reality was that bounty hunting in the medieval world also carried significant social and political incentives. In a society defined by feudal relationships, loyalty, and power struggles, the rewards for bounty hunters could dramatically improve their standing within the social hierarchy. A single successful mission could propel an otherwise obscure individual into the ranks of the powerful, affording them respect and influence in a way that money alone could not. One of the most significant rewards that bounty hunters sought was social recognition. In medieval society, respect and honor were often earned through deeds rather than words. Wealth alone, without recognition, often did not afford the same level of power or influence. For bounty hunters, the ability to bring in a fugitive, especially a high-profile target such as a nobleman or notorious criminal, could cement their place in the social fabric of their community. This was particularly important because medieval society was heavily stratified, with strict divisions between the nobility, clergy, and commoners. For commoners, particularly those from humble backgrounds, the opportunity to earn recognition and move beyond their birth status was incredibly rare, and bounty hunting, with its potential for reward, offered a rare avenue for upward mobility. Bounty hunters who had been successful in their craft often became local celebrities. Their names were whispered in villages, towns, and courts, with tales of their exploits circulating in both the local community and beyond. In some instances, bounty hunters were immortalized in songs, poems, and stories. These tales, though often embellished, highlighted their bravery, cunning, and sometimes ruthlessness, transforming them into figures of folklore. As these stories spread, the bounty hunters themselves were elevated from mere hired guns to folk heroes, celebrated for their bravery and skill in overcoming great danger. This social recognition was not merely a byproduct of the profession, but a central motivating factor for many bounty hunters. In medieval times, where the notion of personal legacy was deeply tied to honor and reputation, the ability to gain recognition for successful hunts could ensure a lasting place in history. Such recognition brought with it privileges, invitations to feasts and councils, and opportunities for further advancement. It was a reward that offered both immediate gratification and the promise of long-term prestige, one that could last for generations in the form of legends passed down to future generations. Furthermore, bounty hunting had the potential to yield political power. During periods of war or social unrest, many lords, kings, and nobles found themselves at odds with enemies, whether internal or external. In these volatile times, the services of bounty hunters were not just about capturing criminals or traitors. They were about asserting political dominance. A bounty hunter who captured a rival noble or suppressed a rebellion would have not only earned a financial reward, but would also have the favor of those in power. This favor could translate into political influence, providing the bounty hunter with future contracts, recognition, and even a say in the affairs of the realm. In feudal systems where land and titles were the currency of power, the political rewards for bounty hunters could be more valuable than gold. In some cases, they were promised land, which would elevate them from commoners to landowners with the ability to collect taxes from peasants. This reward was particularly attractive in a society where land was the primary source of wealth and power. For a bounty hunter, a successful capture might open the doors to a life of luxury, with the right to govern a small region and influence the local population. But it wasn't just political and social power that drove bounty hunters. It was also personal legacy. The medieval world was preoccupied with the concept of legacy, the idea that one's actions would be remembered and their name would live on in history was an integral part of societal mindset. Kings and lords sought to have their names etched in history through their conquests, while knights and warriors earned honor through valor in battle. For bounty hunters, success was not only about financial gain, but about the opportunity to build a lasting legacy through their actions. The most successful bounty hunters, like the legendary figures of the time, were remembered long after their deaths for the risks they took and the notorious criminals they captured. This sense of legacy was incredibly important in medieval times, when families built their reputations over generations. For bounty hunters who came from humble origins, the opportunity to create a name for themselves and to be immortalized in stories could be the most rewarding aspect of their work. While many bounty hunters were motivated by immediate rewards like money or land, it was a lasting recognition of their contributions to society, their communities, and their rulers that often served as the most meaningful reward. Bounty hunting also offered a certain degree of freedom that was not available in many other professions. Unlike knights, who were bound by the codes of chivalry, or soldiers, who served under the command of kings and generals, bounty hunters operated independently. They were not tied to any one lord or faction, and could choose which missions to accept or reject. This autonomy was appealing to many who sought to make their own way in the world, particularly in a time when serfdom and rigid social hierarchies restricted the mobility of most people. The nature of the profession itself also meant that bounty hunters were typically individualistic, operating outside the law, yet always working within its confines when necessary. Their willingness to take risks and live on the edge appealed to those who found themselves dissatisfied with the limitations of traditional roles. For bounty hunters, the rewards weren't simply about money. They were about the satisfaction of living a life of autonomy, bravery, and honor, even if those ideals were often fluid and subject to interpretation. Despite all the material and social rewards, the most alluring reward for many bounty hunters may have been a sense of power and control over their own fate. In a world where the lives of ordinary people were dictated by the whims of kings, lords, and other powerful figures, bounty hunters had a unique form of self-determination. They could chart their own course, decide their own destiny, and, to some degree, wield the power that came with being able to bring a criminal to justice, or, sometimes, exact vengeance. In this sense, the rewards of bounty hunting were not just a matter of gold, land, or status. They were about the feeling of power that came from achieving something that many others could not. The bounty hunter's role in society, whether viewed as a necessary agent of justice or as a mercenary for hire, allowed them to step outside the traditional structures of medieval life. In a world where most people were bound by their social class, birthright, and loyalties, bounty hunters had the rare opportunity to define their own worth and leave a mark on history. In conclusion, the rewards of medieval bounty hunting went far beyond material wealth. They were about social mobility, political power, personal legacy, freedom, and a very real sense of self-determination in a time when few were afforded such luxuries. These deeper rewards, while intangible, played a significant role in motivating bounty hunters to take on the risks and dangers of the profession. The pursuit of justice, whether for personal gain, for fame, or for honor, was a powerful motivator, one that transcended the material and spoke to the core of human ambition and desire for recognition. Chapter 2. The profession became so popular. The rise of bounty hunting in medieval Europe was not a mere coincidence or an isolated occurrence. It was intrinsically tied to the broader social and political context of the time, particularly to the weaknesses in the legal systems that governed much of Europe during the medieval period. The absence of a strong, centralized legal authority in many parts of medieval Europe created a vacuum that bounty hunters were able to fill, offering a solution to a problem that was deeply rooted in the structure of society. Medieval Europe, particularly during the early and high Middle Ages, was a fragmented landscape divided into numerous small kingdoms, principalities, duchies, and fiefdoms. These divisions, a consequence of the feudal system, meant that the application of law varied widely from one region to another. In an era where power was decentralized and local lords held significant sway over their territories, law enforcement was often left to those who had the means and the desire to carry out justice themselves. This was a far cry from the centralized systems of governance and law enforcement that emerged later, where national laws were enforced by professional police forces or courts. The feudal system itself, with its complex layers of power, was one of the primary reasons for the legal instability of the medieval period. At the top of the pyramid were kings and emperors, but their power was often limited to specific regions, and their ability to enforce laws outside of their immediate control was weak. Below the monarchs were the lords, barons, and knights, each governing over their lands and people, often with little interference from the crown. While these lords had the authority to uphold justice within their own fiefs, the enforcement of laws was typically a matter of personal discretion, and the extent to which they were enforced depended on the lord's power, resources, and sense of fairness. In some cases, local laws were little more than the whims of the lord himself, applied inconsistently, and often in ways that favored the ruling class. This lack of consistency in law enforcement created fertile ground for the rise of bounty hunters. In areas where the law was lax, or where authorities lacked the manpower or will to pursue criminals, bounty hunters became a natural and necessary solution. They were independent agents who could be hired to track down and apprehend criminals, particularly those who had fled from justice or committed crimes too serious for the local authorities to handle. The lack of an organized professional police force meant that someone needed to take on the responsibility of capturing these criminals, and bounty hunters stepped in to fill that gap. The absence of centralized law enforcement also meant that punishments for crime were inconsistent and often arbitrary. In the medieval period, punishment for crimes ranged from fines and imprisonment to more brutal methods, such as hanging, burning at the stake, or even drawn-out executions designed to serve as public spectacles. For a common criminal, especially one who had committed a serious offense, the fear of punishment was often enough to send them fleeing, sometimes even taking refuge in distant lands or remote regions where the reach of local authorities did not extend. As a result, many fugitives could not be apprehended by the usual means. This led to the necessity of bounty hunters who could pursue criminals across boundaries that the official authorities were unable or unwilling to cross. What made bounty hunters particularly valuable in such a society was their flexibility and ability to operate outside of the traditional legal constraints. Unlike the local constables or sheriffs, who were bound by the limitations of the law and the jurisdiction of their territories, bounty hunters could pursue their targets wherever they went. They were free agents who worked for the reward and had the freedom to track down criminals in neighboring towns, other regions, or even foreign lands. They were not constrained by the legal complexities that plagued the average lawman. If someone was willing to pay the price, a bounty hunter would hunt down the criminal and bring them to justice, regardless of where they had fled. Moreover, medieval legal systems were often incredibly slow and cumbersome. Trials could take months or even years to complete, and during that time, accused criminals could escape or simply wait out the legal proceedings. In many regions, the judicial process was a slow, inefficient, and often corrupt system that allowed criminals to slip through the cracks. The noble class and wealthier individuals, in particular, were often able to use their influence to evade justice or manipulate the legal system to their advantage. This created frustration among those who sought justice for wrongs committed against them, and the solution came in the form of bounty hunters, individuals who could act quickly and decisively, providing a speedier, albeit unregulated, means of capturing criminals. The law was also heavily influenced by the church during the medieval period, and this often complicated matters. Religious institutions wielded significant power, and in some cases, they had their own courts and systems of justice. The church's view on justice, particularly in cases of heresy or blasphemy, could sometimes conflict with secular law, creating a system that was both inconsistent and, at times, difficult to navigate. Bounty hunters often found themselves in a situation where their targets could be hiding behind protection of the church, making them even harder to apprehend. The church's immunity from secular law and its vast influence made it difficult for local authorities to enforce justice effectively, leaving bounty hunters to deal with criminals who had the resources to find sanctuary within the church's walls. This disparity between the rich and the poor also contributed to the rise of bounty hunting. The wealthy, with their power and influence, could afford to evade justice, while the poor were often at the mercy of the legal system. For commoners, particularly those without land or titles, seeking justice for a wrong could be a frustrating and fruitless endeavor. A thief who stole from a commoner could easily escape the law, while the victim had few options for redress. In such cases, a bounty hunter was often the only way for the wronged party to have a chance at justice. These bounty hunters, though operating outside the official legal system, provided a critical service to those who had no other means of redress. The growing need for stability in medieval society also played a significant role in the proliferation of bounty hunters. During times of war, rebellion, and social upheaval, there was a constant need to restore order. Fugitives from justice, especially those involved in political or military conflicts, were often seen as a threat to the stability of the realm. As monarchs and lords struggled to maintain control over their territories, they relied more and more on bounty hunters to track down and eliminate these threats. The profession became a vital component of maintaining the peace in a world where official authorities were often stretched thin, and the line between law and disorder was tenuous at best. The rise of bounty hunting in medieval Europe can be attributed to the weaknesses of the legal systems of the time. The decentralized nature of power, slow and inconsistent justice, and the influence of the church all contributed to a legal system that was often inadequate to handle the demands of an increasingly complex society. Bounty hunters stepped in to fill the gap, offering a solution to the growing need for law enforcement that was not bound by the limitations of medieval law. They became an essential part of maintaining order in a world where the law was often a fluid concept, and where the pursuit of justice required not only authority, but also the willingness to act outside constraints of official power. The tumultuous nature of medieval Europe played a significant role in the rise of bounty hunting as a profession. Constant warfare, rebellion, and social unrest created an environment where criminal activity flourished, and the traditional systems of law enforcement were often incapable of dealing with the threats facing society. In times of crisis, whether caused by external invasions, internal revolts, or the shifting allegiances between nobles, medieval authorities found themselves unable to effectively maintain order or bring criminals to justice. It was in this chaotic landscape that bounty hunters found a niche, becoming essential players in the efforts to apprehend criminals, control threats, and restore stability to regions ravaged by unrest. During periods of war, particularly the frequent military conflicts between feudal lords, kingdoms, or even entire empires, criminals often took advantage of the chaos. With armies marching across the land and the devastation of battles spilling over into civilian areas, law and order were often suspended. During such times, criminals, especially those who had been caught up in the chaos of conflict, had the opportunity to escape the reach of traditional law enforcement. The need for swift, decisive action became even more apparent, and as the authorities struggled to maintain control, bounty hunters filled the void, chasing down criminals who were otherwise beyond the reach of law enforcement. These times of instability, when social structures were often fractured, created fertile ground for criminal activity. Many criminals took advantage of war to escape the consequences of their actions. Rebels, deserters, thieves, and outlaws found it easier to evade capture, slipping into the confusion of battles or the disarray of collapsing governments. The lack of organized state power meant that justice was often slow, inconsistent, or altogether non-existent. In response, bounty hunters were hired to track down these criminals, regardless of their background or crime. The need for bounty hunters became especially pronounced after the devastation of a major battle or military campaign. Following battles such as the 100 Years' War or other large-scale feuds between warring kingdoms, leaders were desperate to regain control over their lands, territories, and the rule of law. Criminals who had taken advantage of the collapse of order, whether they had stolen goods, plundered villages, or fled their duties as soldiers, posed a significant threat to the stability of society. Bounty hunters were brought in to apprehend such individuals, sometimes working with military forces or local lords to ensure that the criminals were brought to justice and order could be restored. Political rebels and traitors. Bounty hunting was not limited to common criminals or petty thieves. During times of social upheaval, political rebels and traitors were some of the most dangerous individuals that monarchs and lords sought to eliminate. In a feudal society, where loyalty to one's ruler or lord was of utmost importance, betrayal was seen as one of the most grievous offenses. Rebellions were frequent as serfs, peasants, and even nobles sought to gain more power, autonomy, or land. Political conflicts, uprisings, and revolutions could destabilize entire regions, and it was during such periods that the role of bounty hunters became even more critical. In times of rebellion, those who led uprisings or defected from their political allegiance were often marked as traitors and enemies of the state. Such figures were typically hunted down by bounty hunters, who were hired to capture or eliminate them in exchange for a generous reward. A successful capture of a rebel leader or a traitor not only brought financial gain, but also political favor, as it allowed the ruling powers to reassert control and eliminate a threat to their authority. Bounty hunters were seen as useful instruments in quelling resistance, and their work was often viewed as essential to maintaining the stability of the ruling class. In many cases, bounty hunters didn't just bring criminals to justice. They became instrumental in the political machinations of kings and lords. By capturing rebel leaders or traitors, bounty hunters helped to strengthen the power of the monarchy or nobility. Their success could make them valuable allies to the ruling elite, ensuring future work and possibly even rewards such as land, titles, or positions of power. The process of capturing rebels or traitors was not always straightforward. Many of these criminals were not just hiding in remote locations, but were often supported by sympathizers or organized underground movements. In these cases, bounty hunters had to engage in more sophisticated forms of tracking and intelligence gathering, often relying on their networks, informants, and connections. They had to be both skilled in combat and resourceful in gathering information, as the criminal targets were often part of organized, well-supported factions. This complex environment, in which criminals could hide among political movements or powerful families, created an ongoing demand for bounty hunters. It was not just a question of finding a fugitive. It was about understanding the larger political dynamics of the time, navigating dangerous social landscapes, and bringing justice to those who threatened the status quo. Desertion and criminals among soldiers. The chaos of medieval wars also created an environment where soldiers, mercenaries, and knights were frequently turning to a life of crime. The collapse of structured armies or the breakdown of military discipline during prolonged conflicts often led to soldiers abandoning their posts, deserting their comrades, and engaging in criminal activities. Desertion was a serious crime during wartime, and a soldier who fled the battlefield could be sentenced to death or severe punishment if caught. As armies advanced, marched, and moved across the land, the civilians caught in the crossfire were often subjected to plunder, robbery, and violence by soldiers who had lost their discipline. The soldiers, frustrated by unpaid wages or hardships, would raid villages, steal from merchants, or attack anyone who was in their path. Bounty hunters were often enlisted to track down and apprehend these deserters or criminals who had turned to marauding and theft. In some cases, deserters would seek refuge in neighboring territories, sometimes joining mercenary groups or rebel factions. These criminals, once trained warriors, could become formidable opponents, making them difficult targets for the typical authorities. Their ability to organize and fight made them dangerous enemies, and it was often left to bounty hunters to track and eliminate them. The rewards for capturing or killing deserters were high, especially if the fugitive was considered to be an experienced soldier or a potential threat to the peace of the region. The need to control these individuals, particularly those who had military experience, was pressing. Bounty hunters were seen as a necessary tool for bringing these criminals to justice, helping protect the innocent and ensure that military conflicts did not lead to even more instability and violence. The ruthless pursuit of these fugitive soldiers, who could be equipped with armor, weapons, and combat skills, made bounty hunting a dangerous profession, but also one that was integral to maintaining order in a war-torn world. Criminal networks and outlaws. Beyond individual criminals, the social unrest of medieval Europe also led to proliferation of outlaw groups and criminal networks. As society broke down under the pressure of war, economic hardship, and social instability, large groups of outlaws formed in the wilderness, in forests, and in abandoned castles. These criminal groups operated much like modern-day gangs, engaging in smuggling, banditry, extortion, and other illegal activities. Many of these criminals were former soldiers who had deserted, as well as peasants who had turned to crime out of desperation. Bounty hunters were often tasked with hunting down these outlaw groups. They would track the movements of the criminals, gather intelligence, and plan strategic attacks to dismantle their operations. The rewards for apprehending a group of outlaws could be substantial, as these bands often pose a significant threat to the surrounding communities. The lawless nature of these criminal groups, combined with their violent tendencies, made them particularly dangerous. For bounty hunters, bringing down an outlaw group was one of the most challenging and lucrative missions they could undertake. These criminal networks often operated in remote, rugged areas where law enforcement could not easily reach. The bounty hunters, therefore, had to rely on their skills of tracking, stealth, and combat to infiltrate these areas and neutralize the threat. Their success in capturing or killing these outlaws could solidify their reputation, making them not just a tool of the state, but a necessary part of maintaining order and security in a dangerous and volatile world. The medieval period was marked by stark divisions in wealth, where power and influence were often directly tied to land, livestock, and precious metals like gold and silver. In this world, the prospect of gaining wealth was incredibly appealing, and for many, bounty hunting offered a rare opportunity to escape poverty. Bounty hunters operated outside the official legal systems, their payment depended on the criminals they captured or killed. The rewards for bringing in high-profile criminals could be vast, often in the form of money, land, or titles. For a common person, this was an incredibly attractive offer, a chance to rise above their station in life. Medieval society was based on a rigid hierarchy. Most people, particularly peasants, were tied to the land they worked and had little hope of acquiring wealth. The feudal system placed enormous power in the hands of nobles and monarchs, while commoners were left with little to no means of social mobility. For many living in such a system, bounty hunting presented a rare opportunity to change their circumstances. A successful bounty hunter could earn a fortune that allowed them to buy land, gain social standing, and live a life that was otherwise unattainable. Land ownership was a significant draw, particularly in a society where wealth was often linked to agricultural production. If a bounty hunter could capture a fugitive with a high reward, they might find themselves with land to call their own, a life-changing asset. Land was not just a means of subsistence, but a way to establish oneself within society. For those born into poverty, such an opportunity was rare. Bounty hunters could use their earnings to not only support themselves, but also to secure a place in the social fabric, gaining respect and influence. While some bounty hunters came from noble or wealthy backgrounds, the majority were commoners, struggling to make a living in a world that offered little to those without land or connections. For them, the chance to earn a significant reward to the capture of a criminal was an opportunity to gain freedom. Freedom from poverty, from servitude, and from the rigid constraints of their social class. The allure of wealth meant that many saw bounty hunting as a way to seize control of their own fate, to escape the grinding hardships of their daily lives. With a single successful hunt, they could change their lives forever. For the wealthy, bounty hunting could be an investment, too. Nobles or lords, unable or unwilling to risk their own lives, would often hire bounty hunters to capture criminals, rebels, or political enemies. These wealthy benefactors would offer a share of the reward, sometimes providing significant sums of money or future favors. This arrangement allowed nobles to protect their lands and assert their power while remaining distant from the violence and danger involved. The rewards, therefore, were not just financial but strategic, allowing the wealthy to use bounty hunters as instruments of control, whether for personal gain or political advantage. Beyond land and money, the rewards of bounty hunting also extended to status and recognition. In medieval Europe, honor and reputation were just as valuable as wealth. A successful bounty hunter, particularly one who brought in a high-profile criminal or rebel leader, could achieve fame within their community. These individuals were often celebrated in ballads, stories, and oral traditions. The tales of their deeds spread far and wide, transforming them into local legends. Such recognition, albeit fleeting, offers a sense of immortality that many sought in a world where social mobility was otherwise limited. In addition to material gain, bounty hunters also experienced a certain degree of freedom that most medieval workers did not. Unlike serfs bound to land or soldiers who served under a lord's banner, bounty hunters operated independently. They could choose which targets to pursue, decide their own methods, and work without the constraints imposed by a feudal lord. This autonomy was highly appealing, especially for those who sought to carve out their own path in a society where most people were forced to accept their station. The freedom to act on one's own terms, coupled with potential for wealth, made bounty hunting a highly attractive profession for many. However, it wasn't just about the reward itself. The thrill of the hunt, the challenge of tracking down and capturing a fugitive, was another driving force for many bounty hunters. For some, the pursuit was just as important as the payoff. The excitement of the chase, the chance to outsmart, outfight, and finally catch a dangerous criminal provided a sense of satisfaction and personal accomplishment that money alone could not offer. These individuals were often driven by pride, reputation, and the desire to prove their skills, making the reward both a tangible and an intangible motivator. At the same time, the bounty hunting profession carried inherent moral ambiguity. The pursuit of wealth often came at the cost of ethics. Bounty hunters, especially those motivated by money, were sometimes willing to resort to whatever means necessary to capture their target. This could mean using trickery, deception, or even violence. For many bounty hunters, the promise of gold and land outweighed any moral considerations. Whether they were pursuing criminals who had stolen from the rich or political enemies who posed a threat to the state, the line between right and wrong was often blurred. In some cases, they were no better than the criminals they chased, driven by the same desire for power and wealth. The allure of money, particularly in the form of high bounties for dangerous criminals, was a powerful motivator for both noble and common bounty hunters. For the wealthy, the profession provided a way to rid themselves of dangerous enemies or rebellious subjects while avoiding the risks of direct confrontation. For the commoners, it offered the chance to escape poverty, gain land, and achieve a level of respect and power that was otherwise out of reach. Regardless of their background, bounty hunters were drawn to profession by the opportunity to earn a living on their own terms, to rise above their social class, and to secure a future that promised freedom and wealth. Ultimately, the prospect of personal gain, whether in the form of money, land, or social prestige, was central to the appeal of bounty hunting. In a society where power and wealth were the keys to survival and success, the rewards offered by bounty hunting were enough to attract individuals from all walks of life. The opportunity to achieve both financial and social rewards, to live outside the constraints of the feudal system, made bounty hunting a profession like no other. And despite the risks, it remained a desirable path for those seeking to change their circumstances and secure a better future. Chapter 3: Tools and Methods of the Trade. Medieval bounty hunters were not simply individuals who waited for a contract to capture a criminal. They were highly skilled professionals, and their success depended on a combination of practical weaponry, tactical prowess, and advanced tracking techniques. In an era where traditional law enforcement was ineffective, bounty hunters had to be versatile, relying on their ability to track down and capture criminals in a world where danger lurked at every turn. They carried not only weapons for self-defense and combat, but also the knowledge to track their prey across vast and often hostile terrains. The combination of these tools made them fearsome adversaries and reliable agents of justice, or, in some cases, agents of personal gain. Weaponry and combat skills. The weaponry available to bounty hunters in medieval times was varied and depended largely on their specific needs and the criminals they pursued. Unlike modern law enforcement officers who rely on firearms and advanced technology, medieval bounty hunters worked with the tools of the time, most notably swords, axes, crossbows, and longbows. These weapons were essential to their work, as they often had to confront dangerous criminals who were armed and capable of putting up a fight. Swords were the most iconic weapons of the medieval period and were often carried by bounty hunters as both a symbol of authority and a practical tool for close combat. A well-forged sword could be used to defend oneself in a fight or to subdue a criminal quickly. For bounty hunters, having a quality sword was essential, as they often had to engage in hand-to-hand combat with their targets. The sword's versatility allowed bounty hunters to defend themselves on foot or horseback, while also allowing them to intimidate or subdue their targets without necessarily killing them. Axes, especially battle axes, were another commonly used weapon. These were particularly effective for bounty hunters who needed to disarm or incapacitate their targets with a single blow. The sharp, weighted blade of an axe could easily penetrate armor or cause serious injury to an opponent. Axes were also useful in situations where a more brutal or precise weapon was required, such as when dealing with a criminal who refused to surrender peacefully. For bounty hunters, axes were seen as a weapon of power, capable of delivering decisive blows in combat. Crossbows and longbows provided bounty hunters with a ranged option to capture or kill criminals from a distance. The crossbow, in particular, became an essential weapon for bounty hunters during the medieval period due to its ability to fire powerful bolts that could pierce armor or incapacitate a target from afar. Unlike traditional bows, the crossbow had a much higher draw weight and was easier to use, making it accessible to individuals who might not have had the same training as archers. The crossbow's accuracy and force made it a favored weapon among bounty hunters who preferred to take down their targets without engaging them in close combat. Crossbow bolts could be fitted with various types of heads, barbed, broadhead, or even poisoned, depending on the bounty hunter's needs. The longbow, though less commonly used in the crossbow by bounty hunters, was another effective ranged weapon. It required skill and precision to master, but could deliver powerful shots over great distances. When deployed effectively, the longbow allowed bounty hunters to track and neutralize their targets from a distance, especially when pursuing criminals who had a head start or were on the move. Tracking techniques and survival skills. While weapons were a critical part of a bounty hunter's arsenal, it was their ability to track and hunt down criminals across harsh and often unforgiving landscapes that truly set them apart from other figures of law enforcement. Medieval bounty hunters were often tasked with capturing fugitives who had fled into remote forests, mountains, or even foreign territories. And to do so, they had to rely on their knowledge of the land, their keen observation skills, and their training in tracking. The ability to track footprints was one of the most important skills a bounty hunter could possess. Footprints, however small or faint, could reveal a wealth of information about a fugitive's movements, the direction they were traveling, and the condition they were in. Experienced bounty hunters could read the type of shoes a person wore, determine the terrain they had passed through, and even estimate how much time had passed since they left a particular area. This skill was invaluable, particularly when pursuing criminals who were trying to evade capture by blending into the environment or traveling through unfamiliar territory. Bounty hunters were trained to observe the smallest signs of movement. They could spot broken twigs, disturbed soil, or animal tracks that indicated a fugitive's path. The more experienced hunters could also follow clues like the direction the wind was blowing, the way branches hung, and the type of foliage that was disturbed in a particular area. These skills were honed through years of practice and experience, often learned through apprenticeships or from those who had spent their lives tracking wild animals. This knowledge of the natural world made bounty hunters formidable, as they could track criminals for days or even weeks, covering vast distances and using their understanding of the land to predict where the fugitive might go next. In addition to tracking footprints and signs of movement, bounty hunters also employed survival skills that allowed them to endure long journeys through difficult terrain. They were experts in navigating forests, mountains, and other wilderness areas, knowing how to find food and water in even the most inhospitable environments. Bounty hunters also had to be skilled in first aid and basic medical treatment, as they were often injured in the course of their work and had to rely on their knowledge to treat wounds and prevent infection. Signaling and communication were also critical components of a bounty hunter's skill set. In the medieval period, bounty hunters often worked in teams, especially when the criminals they were pursuing were dangerous or highly skilled at evading capture. They used a variety of signaling techniques, including whistles, smoke signals, or markings on trees, to communicate with one another when pursuing a target over long distances. These communication methods were essential for coordinating efforts, especially when a fugitive was suspected to be hiding or moving in a specific area. Bounty hunters also had to be adaptable and quick-thinking. They had to know when to push forward and when to lie in wait. They were experts in ambush tactics, using the element of surprise to catch their targets off guard. A bounty hunter might observe a target for hours, waiting for the right moment to strike. Alternatively, they might plan a route to cut off a criminal's escape, relying on their knowledge of the land to predict where the fugitive might go. The art of the pursuit. The methods used by medieval bounty hunters were not solely reliant on brute strength or raw violence. While they were skilled in the use of weapons, their true talent lay in their ability to pursue, outsmart, and capture criminals. This meant using a combination of patience, intelligence, and strategy to bring down even the most elusive fugitives. They had to understand the psychology of their targets, predict their movements, and use the environment to their advantage. Sometimes, A bounty hunter might need to chase down a fugitive through thick forests, across mountains, or through dangerous and unfamiliar territories. Their ability to think ahead, anticipate the next move, and act with precision made them exceptional trackers and formidable opponents. The most successful bounty hunters were those who could combine their combat skills with their understanding of human nature and the environment. They were part warrior, part detective, and part survivalist. The tools of their trade, their weapons, their tracking techniques, and their knowledge of the land were not just for survival. They were integral to the very nature of the work. Every successful capture or kill was a result of an intricate dance between the bounty hunter and their prey, with a hunter's skill in both combat and tracking being the decisive factor in who emerged victorious. In essence, bounty hunting in medieval Europe required a unique blend of combat proficiency, survival instincts, and tactical intelligence. The tools and methods used by bounty hunters were not just about brute force or weaponry. They were about the ability to think critically, read the signs of the land, and outsmart the criminals they pursued. It was this combination of physical and mental skill that made bounty hunters such valuable and feared figures during the medieval period. The life of a medieval bounty hunter was one defined by constant movement, danger, and the need for speed. Unlike the law enforcement systems we are familiar with today, which benefit from technology, communication networks, and centralized jurisdictions, medieval bounty hunters were often required to work alone or in small, decentralized groups. They not only had to track down their targets across vast and often treacherous terrains, but they also faced the immense pressure of time. The fugitives they pursued were rarely easy to catch, and the longer it took for a bounty hunter to close in on their quarry, the more likely the criminal would escape or, worse yet, pose an even greater threat to the safety of surrounding population. In a world with no GPS, no modern transport systems, and no organized police forces to back them up, bounty hunters had to rely on their ability to move quickly, efficiently, and stealthily. The terrain they traversed, forests, swamps, mountains, and rivers, was often unforgiving, and the time-sensitive nature of their work made every choice crucial. They were racing against the clock, but they also had to contend with the dangers of the environment, wild animals, and the likelihood of running into hostile locals or other criminals who were also trying to evade capture. The challenge of tracking in remote locations. The primary obstacle bounty hunters faced was often the terrain itself. In many cases, the criminals they pursued were not confined to cities or easily accessible areas, but fled into the wild or into remote regions where they could disappear among the trees, in caves, or even cross borders into neighboring territories. To track these fugitives, bounty hunters had to be resourceful, using their knowledge of geography, the land, and natural signs to follow the trail. The terrain in medieval Europe was vast and varied. Dense forests were common across the continent, especially in the north, where criminals could hide among trees and underbrush, making it difficult for pursuers to catch sight of them. A hunter's ability to read the forest's subtle clues, disturbed underbrush, broken branches, and footprints was essential. In some cases, bounty hunters would follow these small markers for days, tracking their quarry's movements and calculating the best route to intercept them. Rivers and swamps. Rivers and swamps presented a different set of challenges. These natural barriers could slow the bounty hunter's progress, forcing them to find alternate routes or deal with the added complication of crossing bodies of water. Swamps were particularly difficult to navigate, with hidden bogs and marshy ground that could swallow up even the most experienced travelers. In these environments, the bounty hunter's ability to adapt to the land, choosing the safest route, knowing when to wade through or avoid certain areas, was critical. The dense, waterlogged land provided ideal cover for criminals trying to evade capture, but it was also a dangerous environment that could quickly tire out an unprepared pursuer. A single misstep could result in getting stuck or injured, or worse, losing precious time. Mountains and rough terrain. In mountainous regions, the situation became even more complicated. Mountainous terrain required a specific set of skills. Climbing, navigating steep slopes, and finding safe passages through jagged cliffs or rocky outcroppings. For bounty hunters chasing criminals who were familiar with the area, this type of terrain could give the fugitive a significant advantage. Hiding in the mountains offered natural fortresses where they could take shelter in caves or isolated settlements, making it harder for bounty hunters to locate them. Mountains also brought their own set of dangers. The weather in high-altitude areas could turn quickly, with sudden storms or snowfalls reducing visibility and making it difficult to keep a trail. Extreme temperatures, both cold and heat, could wear down a pursuer, adding another layer of urgency to the hunt. When pursuing someone in such terrain, bounty hunters had to consider the risks of exhaustion, injury, and the potential to get lost, all while trying to maintain the pressure on their target. The pressure of time and fugitives' evasive tactics. Beyond the natural obstacles of the land, bounty hunters face another constant threat: time. Criminals, especially those who knew they were being pursued, often attempted to cover their tracks by changing their routes or taking unexpected turns. As the chase dragged on, the fugitive might double back or employ tactics designed to throw off their pursuers. Some criminals might deliberately walk through muddy patches, leave false footprints, or create other misleading signs to confuse the bounty hunters. The longer the hunter took, the more the fugitive could alter their movements, making the chase increasingly difficult. Additionally, the fugitive might have their own allies or local sympathizers. In many medieval regions, criminal networks or outlaws would find safe havens in villages, with local communities turning a blind eye or even helping fugitives hide from the law. Bounty hunters, therefore, not only had to be adept at tracking physical signs, but also at navigating social obstacles, dealing with people who may refuse to give information or actively mislead them. In these situations, time was doubly important. The longer a bounty hunter spent looking for the criminal in the wrong place, the more likely it was that the fugitive could escape or relocate entirely. The role of stealth and ambush. Given the nature of their work, bounty hunters often found themselves operating in environments where stealth was just as important as speed. To catch criminals, particularly those who had gone into hiding in the wilderness, a bounty hunter needed to use patience and the element of surprise. Stealth allowed them to get close to their target without being detected, which was especially crucial in places like forests or remote villages, where one wrong step could alert the criminal. This led to the common tactic of ambushing. Rather than charging directly into a confrontation, bounty hunters would sometimes lay in wait, carefully observing their targets from a distance before moving in for capture. This method required great patience, as bounty hunters could wait for days before the right opportunity presented itself. They would often set up in strategic locations where they could see the fugitive's movements without being seen themselves, using camouflage or natural cover to conceal their presence. Once the target was close enough, they would strike swiftly, often using traps or surprise tactics to capture or incapacitate the criminal, adapting to the environment. Despite all the tools and strategies available to bounty hunters, perhaps the most important asset in their arsenal was their ability to adapt to the environment. Every pursuit was different, and each terrain required unique knowledge and skills. A bounty hunter who was adept at navigating forests might not be as skilled in mountainous terrain, or vice versa. Thus, successful bounty hunters had to be versatile, adjusting their approach to match the conditions they faced. One of the greatest challenges for bounty hunters was staying ahead of the fugitive while navigating terrain that could take hours, if not days, to cross. Time was of the essence, but moving too quickly could mean missing vital clues or tiring out the hunter. It was a delicate balance. Bounty hunters had to be quick, but they also had to be deliberate, making sure they did not rush into dangerous situations or miss subtle signs that could lead to their quarry. Whether it was crossing rivers, scaling mountains, or tracking through dense forests, the landscape was both an obstacle and an ally to bounty hunters. Their ability to use it to their advantage, by choosing the right path, reading the signs left behind, and knowing when to push forward and when to wait, was key to their success. This constant battle between time, terrain, and the target made bounty hunting one of the most demanding professions in medieval society. Bounty hunters were not just hired thugs. They were skilled professionals who knew how to survive, navigate, and think strategically. They understood the land as much as their targets, and it was this combination of knowledge, resourcefulness, and adaptability that allowed them to thrive in an uncertain and often dangerous world. The race against time, paired with the challenges of navigating unforgiving terrain, defined their lives and made the profession one of both peril and prestige. In the world of medieval bounty hunters, the pursuit of criminals was not always a straightforward chase. While weapons and tracking techniques were essential, some of the most successful bounty hunters relied on a more subtle and cerebral approach. Traps and tricks. These methods allowed bounty hunters to capture their targets without direct confrontation, often reducing the risk of injury or death. The art of setting traps and employing clever ruses was an essential skill, one that combined the knowledge of human behavior, psychology, and the environment to outwit the fugitive. The power of ambush. One of the most common and effective methods bounty hunters used was the ambush. Instead of engaging in a prolonged chase, bounty hunters would often wait for their targets to come to them. This required patience, as it could mean waiting for hours, days, or even weeks in one location. By studying the fugitive's patterns and movements, bounty hunters could predict when and where the target might appear. Once a criminal was in range, the bounty hunter could strike quickly and decisively, often catching the fugitive by surprise. The success of an ambush depended on the bounty hunter's ability to blend into their environment. This meant using natural cover, such as trees, rocks, or buildings, to conceal their presence. Stealth was key. The bounty hunter had to move silently, making sure that no telltale signs of their position, such as broken branches or disturbed soil, alerted the target. In many cases, the bounty hunter would position themselves in places where they could see the target but remain unseen. Behind thick foliage in a forest, atop a ridge, or within an abandoned building. The advantage of such tactics was that the fugitive, unaware of the danger, would walk straight into the trap. Ambushing was particularly useful when dealing with well-armed or dangerous targets. If the bounty hunter believed their target might be too strong to confront directly, setting an ambush allowed them to catch the criminal off guard, giving them the upper hand. In some cases, the bounty hunter might use a distraction, such as making noise in one direction to lure the target into a vulnerable position before launching the attack. Snare traps and restraints. Another key tool in the bounty hunter's arsenal was the trap. Simple yet effective, traps allowed bounty hunters to immobilize or capture criminals without the need for direct combat. The most common traps were snares, cords or ropes tied in such a way that they would tighten when a person stepped into them. These traps were placed in areas where the fugitive was likely to pass, such as forest paths, near water sources, or around the edges of towns. Once the fugitive triggered the snare, they would be caught by the legs or arms, immobilizing them and making it easy for the bounty hunter to approach and make the capture. The bounty hunter's knowledge of terrain and human behavior was essential in setting these traps. A poorly placed snare or trap would be ineffective, either too obvious for the target to notice or too difficult to trigger. An experienced bounty hunter would anticipate the movements of their target, positioning their traps in high-traffic areas or places where the criminal would have little chance to escape once caught. The beauty of the snare was that it allowed the bounty hunter to capture a target without alerting them to the danger. In some cases, the bounty hunter would follow the trail of criminal, knowing exactly when to set the trap and how to ensure the target was taken completely by surprise. Aside from snares, restraint devices like ropes and shackles were also common. These were particularly useful once the bounty hunter had caught their target. The goal was to bind the criminal securely, so they could be transported back to the authorities without risk of escape. Shackles, often made from iron, were an essential part of bounty hunters' gear, especially when dealing with criminals who might be particularly dangerous or prone to resistance. While ropes were useful in securing a target on the move, shackles allowed for a more secure and restrained capture. Poison traps. In more dangerous cases, bounty hunters might resort to poison. Poison traps could incapacitate a fugitive, allowing the bounty hunter to subdue them without having to engage in direct combat. Bounty hunters could coat their weapons, arrows, or even the edges of their traps with poison. A criminal caught in a poison snare would soon feel the effects, numbness, dizziness, or even paralysis, making it easier for the bounty hunter to close in on them and complete the capture. Using poison required not only knowledge of the substances that can incapacitate, but also an understanding of when to use it. It was a double-edged sword. While poison can neutralize a target without bloodshed, also pose a danger to the bounty hunter. If the criminal fought back or the bounty hunter was not careful with their handling, they too could be affected by the poison. Furthermore, some poisons could be easily detected by the target or by others, making the capture more complicated if the wrong substance was used. The use of poison in medieval bounty hunting was a calculated risk, often saved for the most difficult or dangerous captures. Deceptive tactics and disguises. In addition to physical traps, bounty hunters often relied on deceptive tactics to capture their targets. These tricks can involve pretending to be someone a fugitive trusted, using fake identities, or even setting up false scenarios that would trick the target into revealing themselves. A bounty hunter might, for example, pose as a traveler in need of assistance or as a merchant, hoping to gain the fugitive's trust and then capture them when they were most vulnerable. Disguises were often a part of these strategies. A bounty hunter might dress as a common peasant, a traveler, or even a fellow outlaw to blend in with the criminal's surroundings. By adopting a role that the target would not suspect, the bounty hunter could gain access to places where they might otherwise be turned away. In some cases, bounty hunters would infiltrate criminal networks or align themselves with known criminals, using these connections to gather information or gain the opportunity to strike. This kind of infiltration allowed bounty hunters to bypass the usual dangers of direct confrontation, using manipulation and psychology to secure their target. In addition to personal deception, bounty hunters sometimes use false information to mislead criminals. A bounty hunter might spread rumors or false leads to make the fugitive think they were being pursued in a different direction, only to catch them off guard once the criminal followed the false trail. These tactics worked because they preyed on the fugitive's fear and paranoia, knowing that a criminal on the run would often be on edge and distrustful of anyone they encountered. The psychological game. At the heart of many bounty hunting tactics was an understanding of human nature. Bounty hunters knew that criminals, especially those who had been on the run for an extended period, were often paranoid, anxious, and easy to manipulate. The mental and emotional state of a fugitive could provide the bounty hunter with a significant advantage. Criminals might make mistakes under stress, act rashly out of fear, or expose themselves at a moment of weakness. Bounty hunters capitalize on this by using tricks that would play into the fugitive's emotions and fears. Bounty hunters also knew that many criminals, especially those who were experienced in evading the law, were not easily fooled. As a result, deception was not always about convincing a criminal that they had been captured, but rather about leading them into a trap by playing on their instincts and weaknesses. Whether it was through disguises, false information, or psychological manipulation, the art of deceit was one of the most effective tools in the bounty hunter's kit. Chapter 4. Dangers and Challenges in the Job. One of the most dangerous aspects of being a medieval bounty hunter was a constant threat of direct confrontation with the criminals they were tasked with apprehending. Unlike the modern law enforcement officers who rely on backup, technology, and organized systems of support, medieval bounty hunters often worked alone or in small, isolated groups. They were not just pursuing ordinary criminals. The people they were after could be violent, armed, and desperate. These confrontations could quickly escalate into life-threatening situations where the bounty hunter's skill with weapons, their ability to think on their feet, and their courage were tested to the limit. Medieval criminals, especially those on the run, were rarely law-abiding individuals. They often came from rough backgrounds, accustomed to using force to get what they wanted or to escape capture. Many fugitives were seasoned fighters, soldiers, deserters, or former mercenaries who had the training and experience to engage in violent combat. These were not simple thieves or petty criminals. The individuals that bounty hunters tracked down were often deeply dangerous, highly skilled, and willing to do whatever it took to avoid capture. This made every direct confrontation a risky endeavor. Bounty hunters had to face the reality that many of their targets would not go down without a fight. These criminals knew the stakes. If they were caught, they could face execution, imprisonment, or other severe punishments. Therefore, they had little to lose and everything to gain by resisting capture. For bounty hunters, this made direct confrontations especially perilous. They were constantly putting their lives on the line in the hope that they could subdue a criminal without being killed or gravely injured. A misstep in such a confrontation could easily result in the bounty hunter's demise. While bounty hunters were often well-armed, they still faced significant challenges when it came to dealing with a criminal who was also armed. Swords, axes, and crossbows were commonly carried by criminals, and in many cases, the bounty hunter would find themselves facing a combatant who was equally skilled with their weapon of choice. This was particularly true when the fugitive was someone who had military experience. A former soldier or mercenary was no easy target, and fighting such a person in direct combat was always dangerous. The bounty hunter could easily be overpowered, especially if the criminal was younger, stronger, or more experienced. The risk of injury in these direct confrontations was high. Even a skilled bounty hunter with a sword could be wounded by a quick thrust or a lucky strike from the criminal. The injury sustained in such encounters could be serious, as medieval medical knowledge was limited. A deep wound from a sword or axe could lead to infection or death if left untreated. In an era where healing was slow and often inadequate, bounty hunters faced a very real possibility of permanent injury. Even if they survived, they would carry the scars of their profession for the rest of their lives. Another danger that bounty hunters face in these confrontations was the element of surprise. Criminals, particularly those who had been on the run for some time, were often on high alert, aware that they were being pursued. They were just as likely to ambush the bounty hunter as the bounty hunter was to catch them unaware. These encounters were often unpredictable. The fugitive might have hidden weapons or traps set in place to delay or kill the hunter. They might have set up an escape route or called for reinforcements. Bounty hunters had to be constantly vigilant, always prepared for the unexpected. The environment, whether it was a dense forest, a bustling marketplace, or a dark alley, could turn a simple chase into a deadly game of cat and mouse. Physical exhaustion was also a factor that played into these confrontations. A bounty hunter might spend days, weeks, or even months tracking a criminal across rugged terrain. The fatigue that built up from constant travel, lack of sleep, and limited food could diminish their ability to react quickly in a confrontation. While bounty hunters were typically in good physical condition, the strain of the hunt could weaken even the most seasoned veteran. This was especially true during long pursuits or when the criminal was able to elude capture for extended periods. The longer the pursuit lasted, the greater the chances that the bounty hunter's stamina would fail them at a crucial moment. Despite these challenges, the bounty hunter's success often relied on quick decision-making. In a direct confrontation, there was no time for hesitation. A split-second delay could be the difference between life and death. Bounty hunters had to act decisively, using their weapons effectively, whether they were engaging in a sword fight or confronting an armed criminal. A bounty hunter could not afford to second-guess themselves. They needed to have confidence in their ability to execute their plan, knowing that hesitation could allow the fugitive to escape or strike first. However, not all confrontations were physical. Many times, a bounty hunter would have to negotiate with their target, especially when dealing with criminals who were cornered or injured. In some cases, a criminal would surrender willingly, seeing the odds stacked against them. Other times, bounty hunters might offer a deal or promise to let the criminal go free in exchange for information or cooperation. These moments required a different set of skills, persuasion, and psychological insight. A bounty hunter had to read their target, gauge their level of fear or desperation, and know whether it was worth attempting to negotiate or whether they needed to act swiftly. For bounty hunters, the mental toll of these confrontations was just as heavy as the physical danger. The pressure to succeed, the weight of pursuing dangerous criminals, and the constant threat of death or injury could take a psychological toll over time. Many bounty hunters were constantly under stress, knowing that each mission could be their last. They had to be prepared to confront criminals who might resist in unexpected ways, and that uncertainty created an atmosphere of constant danger. Over time, this kind of stress could lead to burnout, mental exhaustion, and emotional trauma. In the end, direct confrontations were the defining feature of a bounty hunter's life. They were dangerous, unpredictable, and often deadly. Whether facing off against a lone thief, a violent deserter, or a rebellious traitor, bounty hunters had to constantly test their skills and resolve. The thrill of the chase was undeniable, but the risks involved were immense. For many, it was a life lived on edge, where success brought wealth, recognition, and respect, but failure brought injury, death, or the failure to bring criminals to justice. The stakes were always high, and the danger was ever present, making direct confrontations with criminals the most perilous and defining part of the job. The life of a medieval bounty hunter was not only fraught with physical dangers from criminals, but also marked by the often grueling and harsh living conditions they endured during their pursuits. Unlike modern law enforcement officers who are typically provided with logistical support, resources, and sometimes even comfort, medieval bounty hunters had to operate in environments that tested their endurance, survival skills, and mental resilience. For a bounty hunter, a successful capture or kill might be followed by days or weeks of harsh conditions in the wilderness, with little more than their basic gear, weapons, and resourcefulness to rely on. Endurance and survival in the wilderness. Medieval bounty hunters often pursued criminals across vast, rugged landscapes, forests, swamps, mountains, and barren lands, where even seasoned travelers could easily lose their way. The challenge of navigating such diverse terrains was a constant reality for bounty hunters. Unlike today's modern conveniences, there were no clear maps, no established trails, and no GPS systems to guide them through the wilderness. The bounty hunter's survival depended entirely on their ability to read the natural environment, understanding the way rivers flowed, which direction the wind was blowing, or recognizing animal tracks that could provide clues about their target's path. The physical toll of such travel was immense. A bounty hunter might have to spend days walking through dense forests, climbing mountains, or wading through swamps. The effort required to travel long distances, especially with little food or water, took a heavy toll on the body. Even the most well-conditioned hunters were vulnerable to exhaustion, dehydration, and malnutrition. The prospect of pursuing a criminal through difficult terrain, with no guarantee of success, meant that bounty hunters had to be incredibly tough, both mentally and physically. The constant threat of illness. In addition to the physical strain, bounty hunters were also at constant risk of falling ill. Without the medical knowledge or resources we have today, a simple injury or minor illness could become a life-threatening situation. Bounty hunters often had to deal with infected wounds, particularly in the absence of proper medical care. Any injury sustained in the line of duty, from a scratch that turned septic to a deep cut caused during a confrontation, could turn into a serious health issue, particularly when the hunter was far from any form of civilization. Diseases were rampant during the medieval period, especially during the summer months when insects, such as mosquitoes, would carry deadly diseases like malaria or the plague. Swamps and marshlands, areas bounty hunters would often have to navigate, were breeding grounds for these diseases. Without modern sanitation or antibiotics, even a small mosquito bite could lead to a debilitating illness. Furthermore, contaminated water sources were another hidden danger. The lack of clean drinking water meant that bounty hunters had to rely on streams, rivers, or ponds, many of which were contaminated with bacteria or parasites. Illness could strike at any moment, making survival even more precarious for bounty hunters already struggling with the demands of their work. Lack of food and water. One of the most pressing challenges that bounty hunters faced was the constant struggle to find food and water. In many cases, bounty hunters would be forced to travel for long stretches without access to food, relying on whatever they could find in the wild. This often meant living off meager rations or hunting for small game, which could be difficult and time-consuming. The lack of reliable food sources meant that bounty hunters could go hungry for days, which weakened their bodies and reduced their energy levels. Starvation or malnutrition could diminish a bounty hunter's physical strength and mental clarity, making them more susceptible to fatigue or illness. Water, too, was a major concern. While rivers, lakes, and streams might seem like reliable sources, not all bodies of water were safe to drink. As mentioned, many water sources were contaminated by bacteria, parasites, or even human waste, leading to stomach ailments or worse. In some cases, bounty hunters had to make do with water that was murky or foul-tasting, simply to stay hydrated. A lack of clean, accessible water could lead to dehydration, further exacerbating the already difficult conditions they faced. Shelter and weather conditions. As bounty hunters journeyed through hostile landscapes, they often had little to no shelter. While some areas offered caves or abandoned buildings as potential refuge, most of the time, bounty hunters had to make do with makeshift camps. A tent might have been useful, but it wasn't always a practical option in the wild. A bounty hunter often needed to build temporary shelter from natural materials, branches, leaves, or furs, to protect themselves from the elements. This not only required a certain set of survival skills, but also meant that they were at the mercy of the weather. The weather was another major factor that could turn the bounty hunter's pursuit into an excruciating test of endurance. Medieval Europe was subject to drastic shifts in weather, from cold winters with biting winds and snowstorms to scorching summers with little relief from the sun. Rain was frequent and could turn trails into boggy swamps, making travel difficult and dangerous. During the winter months, bounty hunters faced the threat of hypothermia or frostbite as they traversed cold, icy landscapes. Exposure to the elements could lead to illness or, in the worst cases, death if a bounty hunter wasn't able to find shelter and warmth. In the summer, the heat could be just as dangerous. Long hours in the sun without adequate protection could result in heat stroke or sunburn, leaving the bounty hunter physically debilitated. It wasn't just a physical toll of the weather. The mental strain of dealing with oppressive heat or freezing cold also contributed to the overall difficulty of the job. Isolation and mental fatigue. In addition to the physical hardships, mental fatigue was another serious issue for bounty hunters. The long, solitary nature of their work often meant days, weeks, or even months without significant human contact. Bounty hunters worked alone or in small teams, which meant they spent most of their time navigating vast landscapes without the support of others. This isolation could lead to feelings of loneliness, anxiety, and despair. The constant pressure to stay focused, to track a fugitive, and to survive could cause mental exhaustion, especially when bounty hunters found themselves in dangerous or unpredictable situations. The stress of constantly being on the move, chasing down criminals, and dealing with the natural elements took its toll on their mental well-being. The uncertainty of their work, never knowing when a fugitive might be captured or whether they'd survive the journey, added to the psychological strain. The isolation from family, friends, and any semblance of normal life meant that many bounty hunters became more accustomed to the dangers they faced than to the comforts of a stable home. The burden of survival, all of these factors, endurance, illness, lack of food and water, harsh weather, and isolation, combined to create an environment that was both physically and mentally demanding. Medieval bounty hunters faced challenges not only from the criminals they pursued, but also from the hostile world they had to navigate in order to do their work. Every successful capture required the bounty hunter to overcome a myriad of environmental, physical, and psychological obstacles, making their profession one of constant struggle and sacrifice. Surviving these conditions required more than just physical strength. It required resilience, resourcefulness, and a certain mental toughness that not everyone possessed. Bounty hunters had to be prepared to face each day with the knowledge that survival itself was an ongoing challenge. They had to adapt to their circumstances, push through exhaustion, and continue to hunt regardless of the difficulties that lay ahead. Their ability to endure these harsh conditions made them unique figures in the medieval world. Part warriors, part survivors, and always on the edge of danger. The life of a medieval bounty hunter was one of constant danger, but perhaps the greatest challenge they faced was the ever-present threat of failure and death. Every bounty hunter knew that their profession carried with the risk of never returning from a hunt, whether from a failed mission, an ambush by the criminal they were pursuing, or even the harsh conditions of the wilderness. Success was not guaranteed, and for every capture that brought wealth and prestige, there were countless others where the bounty hunter was either outwitted, overpowered, or simply unlucky. This looming threat of failure and its potential consequences was one of the most terrifying aspects of their work. The reality of failure. Failure for a bounty hunter was not just a missed opportunity or the loss of a reward. It could have serious, often deadly, consequences. When bounty hunters took on contracts, they had a single goal: capture or kill the criminal. If they failed, it wasn't just a matter of losing the bounty. It could mean personal injury, the loss of reputation, or even death. Many bounty hunters worked under the authority of local lords, monarchs, or other powerful individuals who offered the bounty. Failure to complete the task often led to punishment. While most bounty hunters would be paid a set sum for their efforts regardless of success, those working for a noble or king were often held to a much higher standard. If they failed to deliver the fugitive, particularly one of high status or political importance, there could be serious repercussions. These might range from a loss of future work, being replaced by another hunter, to public disgrace, or even severe penalties. In some cases, bounty hunters could face personal retribution from the very people they were supposed to protect or serve. If a bounty hunter failed to capture a fugitive who was later discovered to be more dangerous or influential than originally thought, they might be blamed for not bringing the criminal to justice. The lack of a formal legal system meant that the consequences of failure could be swift and harsh. A failed bounty hunter, especially one who failed to deliver a high-profile criminal, could find themselves in danger of being branded as incompetent or even punished severely. The dangers of underestimating the criminal. Failure was not always a result of bad luck. It often stemmed from underestimating the criminal or overestimating one's own ability. Many bounty hunters pursued dangerous criminals, some of whom were not just thieves or deserters, but skilled fighters, tacticians, or even former soldiers. These criminals had a vested interest in evading capture at all costs, and would go to extreme lengths to do so. A bounty hunter might think they had cornered their target, only for the fugitive to escape or launch a counterattack that left the hunter gravely injured or dead. Some criminals, particularly those involved in political conflicts or rebellion, had access to alliances and resources that a bounty hunter might not have anticipated. They could find sanctuary with local communities, hide in remote areas, or use disguises to blend in. A fugitive with such connections would not simply run from danger, but fight back with full force. A bounty hunter might find themselves confronting not just an individual criminal, but an entire network of people determined to keep the fugitive safe. In this case, failure wasn't a simple mistake. It could be the result of underestimating the criminal's resourcefulness or resilience. The harsh reality of death. Medieval bounty hunting, as dangerous as it was often a profession that came with an inevitable, unspoken understanding. Death was always a possibility. A bounty hunter's success could hinge on their ability to outfight, outsmart, or even outlast their target. But no matter how skilled or prepared, there was always a chance that the fugitive, or even the environment, would prove too much for the hunter to handle. Many bounty hunters found themselves in situations where combat was inevitable. Engaging a criminal, especially one armed and willing to fight back, was always a risk. Fugitives often fought to the death, knowing that capture meant punishment. And this created scenarios where the hunter was just as likely to be killed as they would succeed in their mission. These confrontations were chaotic and often brutal. A bounty hunter armed with sword, axe, or crossbow could quickly find themselves on the losing side of the fight, particularly if the fugitive was a former soldier or mercenary who had fought in numerous battles. Many bounty hunters paid the ultimate price in these dangerous confrontations, their lives cut short before they could collect their bounty. But death did not only come through violent confrontations. The harshness of the environments that bounty hunters had to navigate also played a significant role in the high mortality rate of the profession. Medieval bounty hunters frequently traversed harsh, inhospitable terrains, dense forests, marshes, rugged mountains, or even desolate plains. The physical toll of trekking through such landscapes, sometimes with little food or water, could lead to exhaustion or injury. In some cases, illnesses like dysentery, cholera, or malaria, which were rampant in the medieval world, could kill a bounty hunter before they even had a chance to complete their task. Poor sanitation and a lack of proper medical care meant that injuries from even small cuts or bites could easily become infected and lead to death. Furthermore, a bounty hunter's mental health was often tested by the dangerous nature of their job. Long periods of solitude and isolation, combined with the pressure of tracking and apprehending criminals, could cause psychological strain. This mental exhaustion could impair their decision-making, causing them to make mistakes that led to their death or the death of their comrades. The constant fear of failure and the ever-present threat of being killed weighed heavily on the mind of every bounty hunter. For many, the psychological toll was as great as the physical dangers they faced. The legacy of failure and death. Even those who survived their hunts often faced the possibility of dying in obscurity, their stories forgotten or overshadowed by the next bounty hunter who came along. While some bounty hunters became legends, their names immortalized in tales of their deeds, the majority of them faded into obscurity. Some failed to return from a hunt. Their bodies never recovered, their fate never known. These men lived and died in the shadows, with only the faintest memory of their name or their mission. Bounty hunters who did return were often scarred, both physically and emotionally, by their experiences. Many carried the marks of battle, wounds that never fully healed, or the psychological scars of witnessing brutal killings. The danger of failure and death never left them. Even after a successful capture, They knew that the next mission could be their last. The profession, despite the financial rewards and prestige it sometimes brought, came at a heavy cost. Bounty hunters knew from the outset that they were playing a dangerous game, one where failure and death were constant companions. For those who chose this life, the risk was always part of the allure, a challenge that many were willing to face in pursuit of wealth, status, or justice. But for many, the price was simply too high. Some lived to see their bounties paid, while others never returned, lost to the unforgiving nature of their job. Chapter 5: The Targets and Famous Captures. Medieval bounty hunters did not pursue just any criminal. The very nature of their profession meant that they often found themselves hunting some of the most dangerous criminals of the time. Figures whose crimes were heinous, whose actions had disrupted the social order, or whose reputations preceded them. These were not petty thieves or minor offenders, but individuals who had committed significant crimes or posed threats to the established power structures. For bounty hunters, pursuing such criminals was not just a job, but a mission fraught with immense risk and significant rewards. Many of the criminals bounty hunters were tasked with apprehending had violent pasts. Some were former soldiers or mercenaries who had turned to a life of crime after leaving the battlefield, while others were outlaws who had been abandoned by society. Many criminals had learned to survive through violence, using their combat skills to overpower those who tried to stop them. For bounty hunters, this meant that capturing such individuals required not only skill in tracking and stealth, but also proficiency in combat. These criminals often didn't surrender easily, and their desperate need to escape or avoid capture made them extremely dangerous. Among the most feared targets were those who had committed political crimes, such as treason, rebellion, or insurrection. In medieval times, treason was considered one of the most serious offenses, as it threatened the stability of the entire social and political system. A criminal accused of treason could easily be a former noble, a royal advisor, or someone who had once held power within the kingdom. To bring such figures to justice was no easy task, as they often had supporters, resources, and a network of allies to protect them. The power dynamics in medieval Europe made treasonous individuals particularly dangerous, as they had the potential to rally factions against the authorities that sought their capture. Rebels and revolutionaries. Rebels who rose up against monarchs or the established feudal system were often seen as either freedom fighters or enemies of the state, depending on one's perspective. For the ruling classes, however, rebels and revolutionaries were criminals who threatened the stability of a realm. Some of the most famous criminals in medieval history were individuals who led or participated in armed uprisings or revolts against feudal lords, monarchs, or foreign invaders. These figures were often celebrated by their followers as heroes, but to bounty hunters, they were simply high-value targets who had to be dealt with. The Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381, for example, led to the formation of a mass rebellion against the king's government, with commoners rising up in protest against taxation and the feudal system. The leaders of this revolt, like Wat Tyler, became the object of intense pursuit by bounty hunters. Tyler, for instance, was eventually killed by the king's soldiers, but his followers and other leaders of the revolt were pursued by bounty hunters, many of whom were tasked with capturing or executing the remaining rebels. This was not an isolated case. Many revolutionaries in medieval Europe became notorious criminals in the eyes of the crown and the ruling elite, with their actions stirring up widespread unrest and requiring swift punishment to prevent further rebellion. Even the most feared traitors could find themselves the target of bounty hunters. High-ranking individuals, such as nobles or military officers who had betrayed their monarch or fellow countrymen, were often seen as prime targets for bounty hunters. A noble who had committed treason could easily have enemies within the royal court, and their capture became a matter of political necessity. These individuals were not only dangerous criminals, but also symbols of disloyalty, making them high-profile targets for bounty hunters who stood to gain wealth, land, and favor from bringing them to justice. Notorious outlaws. Apart from political criminals, bounty hunters were also tasked with pursuing outlaws, individuals who had been rejected by society and had turned to a life of crime, often banding together in groups. These criminals operated outside the law, engaging in robbery, kidnapping, smuggling, and other violent acts. While some outlaws operated alone, many formed notorious bandit groups that could terrorize entire regions. These groups often hid in forests or mountain ranges, making them particularly difficult to capture. They were resourceful and highly skilled at evading law enforcement, using the cover of nature to stay out of sight. Perhaps one of the most famous examples of such a group was the Robin Hood legend, where a group of outlaws famously robbed from the rich and gave to the poor. While the stories of Robin Hood are mostly legendary, they reflect a real societal phenomenon. The presence of outlaws and banditry was widespread in medieval Europe, with many individuals like Robin Hood being regarded as criminals by the authorities, yet viewed as folk heroes by the common people. For bounty hunters, these criminals pose an especially difficult challenge. The criminals often had intimate knowledge of the terrain, and in the case of bandits, they operated in tight-knit groups that were difficult to infiltrate. Capturing or killing an outlaw or an outlaw band required more than just brute force. It required cunning, strategy, and patience. Some of the most dangerous outlaws were those who terrorized towns and villages, engaging in widespread robbery, extortion, and murder. They were often former soldiers or mercenaries who had turned to crime after being discarded by society. These individuals had the skills to command respect among their fellow criminals, and their ability to resist capture for long periods made them highly sought-after targets for bounty hunters. The rewards for capturing such criminals were enormous, as their capture was seen as not just a legal necessity, but also a social and political act aimed at restoring peace to the region. The risks of pursuing high-profile targets. The pursuit of these criminals was fraught with peril. For a bounty hunter, capturing a dangerous criminal meant engaging in life-or-death situations. Many bounty hunters would be required to track their targets through harsh terrain, confront armed and desperate criminals, and face the threat of ambush. These confrontations were often not clean or easy. In many cases, bounty hunters had to rely on their combat skills, tactical planning, and psychological insight to navigate these dangerous encounters. The criminals they pursued were often aware of the risks they faced and would fight to death to avoid capture. For bounty hunters, success wasn't always guaranteed, and the failure to apprehend these dangerous criminals could lead to injury, death, or a permanent loss of reputation. Famous bounty hunts. Throughout medieval history, there were countless famous captures and hunts that made bounty hunters household names. Figures like Edward I of England, who pursued rebel leaders, or King John, who offered bounty for traitors, created an environment where high-profile criminals became the target of well-publicized hunts. For bounty hunters, capturing or killing such criminals wasn't just about financial gain. It was about securing their place in history and gaining favor with powerful lords and monarchs. These hunts often garner much attention from the public, as people were eager to see justice done for those who had broken the law or committed atrocities against society. In the end, bounty hunters were more than just hired killers. They were crucial figures in the battle to restore order to a world constantly threatened by crime, rebellion, and chaos. The criminals they pursued were not just outlaws or thieves, but dangerous individuals who could, if left unchecked, destabilize entire regions. In the pursuit of these criminals, bounty hunters took on the role of both enforcers of justice and agents of change, navigating treacherous environments and confronting dangerous criminals to bring about a measure of stability to a volatile world. Throughout medieval Europe, some of the most infamous criminals became the focus of well-publicized bounty hunts. These hunts were not just about bringing criminals to justice, but also about demonstrating the power of the ruling elite and the effectiveness of bounty hunters in restoring order to unstable regions. For bounty hunters, pursuing high-profile criminals was both a dangerous and rewarding endeavor, often with massive personal stakes. In many cases, these famous hunts became legends in their own right, forever cementing the bounty hunter's name in the annals of history. The capture of rebels and political figures. The medieval period was one of frequent political upheaval, with revolts, rebellions, and civil wars sparking a constant need for bounty hunters. Some of the most famous hunts involved rebels or traitors, individuals who defied monarchs, rulers, or lords in a quest for power, often by using violence or insurrection. The capture of these political figures was seen not just as the enforcement of the law, but as a demonstration of the ruling elite's strength. One of the most famous examples of this type of hunt is Wat Tyler, leader of the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381. Tyler led thousands of peasants in an uprising against the monarchy, protesting taxes and demanding more rights for common folk. After several days of marches and attacks on royal palaces, Tyler was captured and killed by the forces of King Richard II. Although Tyler himself did not survive the rebellion, his death marked the end of the revolt, and the bounty hunters who participated in the suppression of the uprising were vital to the king's ability to maintain control. In the aftermath of the revolt, numerous other leaders and participants were hunted down by bounty hunters. Those who were caught often faced brutal executions, but for the bounty hunters who successfully brought them in, there were substantial rewards, both in money and in political favor. Another major example of famous bounty hunt occurred during the 100 Years' War between England and France. At the time, many French rebels were seen as enemies of the crown, and some of these rebels were highly skilled military commanders or even former nobles who had turned to insurgency. The capture of such rebels was not only crucial for maintaining the king's power, but also for ensuring stability in regions heavily impacted by the war. Often, these individuals fled to remote areas, making them prime targets for bounty hunters. Their capture was seen as not just a legal duty, but a strategic one, essential to quelling rebellion and maintaining political order. The individuals behind these rebellions were often well-resourced, with many able to enlist the help of local communities, making their pursuit incredibly dangerous for bounty hunters. The hunt for criminal outlaws. Not all bounty hunts were politically motivated. Many of the most famous hunts targeted outlaws, criminals who lived outside the law and created havoc in rural areas, villages, and towns. These outlaws were often former soldiers, peasants, or mercenaries who had turned to banditry, and they were seen as a direct threat to the safety of local communities. Some of the most famous medieval outlaws became the subjects of legendary bounty hunts, not only because of their crimes, but also because of their ability to evade capture for long periods. One of the most infamous examples of an outlaw was Robin Hood, the legendary figure who, according to myth, stole from the rich to give to the poor. While the historical accuracy of Robin Hood's story is debated, the tales of his exploits were widely believed to be based on the actions of real criminals who fought against the injustices of the feudal system. The idea of a band of outlaws hiding in the forest and engaging in active resistance captured the imagination of the people. For the authorities, however, Robin Hood and his band of merry men were public enemies. Bounty hunters were tasked with capturing these rebels, who not only stole, but were known for their skill with bows and swords, making them dangerous adversaries. The success of the Robin Hood hunts reflected the broader reality of outlaw captures in medieval society. Criminals who lived in the forest or in remote hideouts were nearly impossible to locate without the help of skilled bounty hunters. These hunts, though dangerous, often had large rewards for the individuals who could track down and capture the criminals. The political and social tension between the ruling class and the outlaws added to the drama of these pursuits, with bounty hunters caught in the middle, serving the needs of the elite while pursuing criminals who had garnered public sympathy. Another example of famous outlaw was Eustace the Monk, a notorious pirate and mercenary who became infamous in the 13th century. Eustace had been a monk before turning to a life of crime, robbing ships and seizing coastal villages. He used his knowledge of monastic orders to evade capture, and for years, he eluded bounty hunters, continuing his reign of terror along the coast of France and England. His capture was a high-profile event, and a group of bounty hunters was finally able to track him down through a combination of maritime and land-based searches. However, Eustace's death in battle showed how risky these hunts could be. The outlaws had long been known to retaliate with violence, and bounty hunters who were sent after them were often put in harm's way. Famous capture of deserters. During times of war, deserters were also considered some of the most dangerous criminals to capture. Soldiers who had deserted their posts were often viewed as traitors, and in some cases, their crimes were considered worse than theft or even murder. This was especially true in the context of the medieval armies, where discipline was key to maintaining an effective fighting force. Desertion meant not only a betrayal of the commander, but also a threat to the unity of the army itself. Many deserters found themselves hunted down by bounty hunters, who were employed to bring them back to face execution or other brutal punishment. One famous instance of this occurred during the 100 Years' War, when English deserters were tracked down in France by professional bounty hunters. These deserters had abandoned their posts in the middle of a critical battle, and their capture became a top priority for English forces. In such cases, the bounty hunters would track the deserters through French countryside, relying on intelligence gathered from local villages and towns to pinpoint their whereabouts. Desertion was a particularly dangerous crime because it undermined the discipline and morale of the army. So bounty hunters who were successful in capturing deserters were handsomely rewarded. Additionally, these individuals often had to face military tribunals, where they were put on trial for their crimes. In many cases, deserters were executed as an example to the rest of the soldiers, making these bounty hunts incredibly high stakes. The psychological impact of high-profile hunts. For bounty hunters, these famous hunts were not just about collecting rewards or securing a place in history. They were psychological battles as well. Each pursuit came with immense pressure, as the criminals they pursued were often not just dangerous but psychologically complex. Political criminals or outlaws like Robin Hood had public support, making them more difficult to track and capture. The weight of a public mission added extra tension for bounty hunters, as their failure was not only a personal loss, but one that could have far-reaching political consequences. Famous captures often brought great notoriety to the bounty hunters involved. Many were celebrated as heroes after bringing down such figures, but in some cases, the pressure to succeed led to burnout or even moral compromise. The public expectations that came with these high-profile captures made the role of bounty hunter both dangerous and emotionally taxing. For those who succeeded, there were great rewards, but for those who failed, there was a potential for loss of reputation or even life. The famous bounty hunts of the medieval period were pivotal in shaping the role of bounty hunters. Whether they were chasing rebels, political traitors, or notorious criminals, these hunts demonstrated the immense dangers faced by those who chose to pursue lawbreakers in a lawless age. While bounty hunters were often celebrated for their cunning, strategy, and ability to track criminals, one of the most perilous and defining aspects of their profession was the intensity of combat they frequently faced. Bounty hunters, armed and skilled, often found themselves in violent, high-stakes confrontations with criminals who were determined to evade capture at any cost. These criminals, who ranged from desperate outlaws to dangerous political rebels, could be as well-armed and capable in combat as the bounty hunters themselves. Confrontations between bounty hunters and their targets were often not just a matter of arresting a fugitive, but surviving the violent resistance that many criminals put up when cornered. Armed and dangerous criminals. Bounty hunters didn't just deal with ordinary criminals. Most targets were armed and dangerous, accustomed to violence and desperate to avoid capture. Many of the criminals hunted by bounty hunters were seasoned warriors, deserters from armies, or former mercenaries who had turned to crime. These individuals had experience in combat and understood how to fight, whether it was with swords, axes, crossbows, or daggers. Bounty hunters were not only tasked with tracking down these criminals, but also were preparing for potentially deadly confrontations. For bounty hunters, an encounter with such a criminal could quickly escalate into a fight for survival. Criminals who were aware that their capture could mean execution or severe punishment often fought to the death. This made bounty hunting particularly dangerous, as it meant that every arrest could end in a violent altercation. While bounty hunters were trained in the use of weapons and combat tactics, their targets often had just as much, if not more, experience in fighting, creating a constant threat of injury or death. In some cases, criminals would attempt to escape using guile and trickery. They might hide their weapons or disguise themselves in a way that allowed them to launch a surprise attack when the bounty hunter was least expecting it. The risk of ambushes was high, as many criminals would attempt to turn the tables by setting traps for the hunter. Bounty hunters had to be prepared for these types of encounters, and often relied on their knowledge of human nature and their environment to gain the upper hand. Battles with organized outlaws and rebellious groups. The situation became even more dangerous when bounty hunters were tasked with pursuing outlaw groups or rebels, who were not only armed but also had the resources to defend themselves. Outlaw bands were often organized, well-coordinated, and entrenched in remote areas like forests, caves, or mountain hideouts. They operated as organized units, making them more formidable adversaries than single criminals. For bounty hunters, capturing or killing an outlaw group required not only individual combat skills, but also a tactical understanding of group dynamics and warfare. The psychological element of hunting such groups was intense. Bounty hunters had to be constantly aware of their surroundings, knowing that an entire group of criminals could ambush them at any moment. The task of capturing a notorious outlaw or a rebel leader often required infiltrating such groups, where the bounty hunter had to gain the trust of the outlaws or wait for the right moment to strike. This was not just about physical confrontation. It was about psychological manipulation, patience, and strategic thinking. One famous example of this was a hunt for the Robin Hood-like bandits, whose exploits were widely known throughout England. These groups operated in forests and countryside, often led by charismatic leaders who could rally followers to their cause. The bounty hunters tasked with capturing these figures faced not only the physical danger of a violent confrontation, but also the possibility of facing a mass attack. The nature of these encounters meant that bounty hunters often had to engage in long and drawn-out sieges or ambushes. Success didn't just rely on finding the target, but on surviving through a tense, drawn-out process of hunting, negotiating, and occasionally facing open combat. The dangers of tracking and capturing political fugitives. The capture of political criminals, such as traitors, rebels, and defectors, added an even more intense dimension to the already dangerous world of bounty hunting. Criminals who had committed high treason or led insurrections were often the most well-protected, with allies who would go to extreme lengths to keep them hidden or safe. These targets often had a network of supporters or local sympathizers, which meant that bounty hunters didn't only have to worry about the criminal, but also the possibility of facing off against groups of armed supporters. Tracking down political fugitives often required navigating complicated political landscapes. Enemies of the state, people sympathetic to the criminal's cause, and other forces working against a bounty hunter. Bounty hunters were often tasked with capturing royal traitors or enemies of the state, individuals who had defected to rival factions, betrayed monarchs, or participated in violent uprisings. These criminals were often well-armed and well-funded, and their supporters could be as dangerous as the fugitive themselves. Bounty hunters who pursued such individuals had to navigate political intrigue and deal with powerful figures who might attempt to stop them from completing their mission. This made the hunts for such figures a psychological and political battlefield in addition to a physical one. One famous example was a hunt for John Ball and Wat Tyler during the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381. Ball, a priest and revolutionary, was considered a dangerous figure by the ruling elites. He had become a rallying point for rebels, urging peasants to rise up against their lords. After the revolt was suppressed, Ball was captured and executed. But his supporters, who believed in his cause, made the bounty hunter's job exceedingly difficult. Bounty hunters tasked with capturing rebels like him had to deal with the complex political ramifications of their mission, making the capture both a matter of physical confrontation and political significance. The violence that came with these types of hunts was not just a matter of individual combat, but also about securing power for those in control, the pressure of reputations, and high-profile targets. When a bounty hunter was called upon to track and capture a notorious criminal or rebel leader, the stakes were incredibly high. Not only was the risk of failure great, but so was the potential for reputation. Successfully capturing a dangerous criminal could elevate a bounty hunter to legendary status, securing them wealth, status, and recognition. Conversely, failure could result in public disgrace, financial ruin, or even death. High-profile captures often brought public attention, meaning bounty hunters could face not just physical violence, but public scrutiny as well. The most successful bounty hunters often became famous figures. Their names spread through folklore, songs, and stories. However, those who failed in their pursuit of dangerous criminals often faced more than just a loss of the bounty. The criminal they were tasked to catch could become even more infamous, while the bounty hunter who failed might be seen as ineffective or weak. The intense pressure of these high-stakes hunts was a part of the life of medieval bounty hunters, making their profession both highly rewarding and immensely risky. The ever-present threat of death. No matter how skilled or prepared a bounty hunter was, the threat of death was always looming in these dangerous encounters. The fugitive might be armed, outnumbered, or in a strong position, and the bounty hunter would have to contend with these factors in every confrontation. Many bounty hunters lost their lives while pursuing high-profile criminals, and others were gravely wounded, left with scars both physical and mental. The violent nature of these hunts made them some of the most deadly and high-risk missions medieval bounty hunters could undertake. The intensity of these confrontations with criminals, whether in the form of direct combat, political intrigue, or strategic hunts, was an essential aspect of the medieval bounty hunter's life. Their skill, perseverance, and courage were constantly tested in the face of danger, and the stakes of failure were often higher than just the loss of a bounty. The potential for injury or death loomed over every hunt, making the profession both perilous and fascinating. Chapter 6. The Power and Morality of Bounty Hunters. Medieval bounty hunters were unique figures in the world of law enforcement. Unlike modern law enforcement officers, who operate within formal structures and are bound by a code of conduct and oversight, medieval bounty hunters enjoyed a level of freedom that was both a strength and a significant moral challenge. They operated as independent agents, often hired to capture criminals for financial reward, with very little oversight and no formal regulations governing their actions. This autonomy allowed bounty hunters to act swiftly and decisively, but also meant that their methods were often unchecked, leading to moral ambiguity and potential abuses. The absence of oversight made bounty hunting an attractive profession for many. In a medieval society where justice was often slow, inconsistent, and influenced by social status, bounty hunters were able to step into the gap and enforce the law. Without the constraints of bureaucracy or institutional regulation, bounty hunters could pursue criminals across vast territories, tracking down fugitives with speed and efficiency. The lack of a formal legal system in many regions allowed bounty hunters to bypass the slow-moving machinery of the law and act based on their own judgment. In theory, this system allowed bounty hunters to pursue justice on behalf of those who needed it most. However, this freedom also came with significant risks. Without ethical oversight or accountability, bounty hunters were free to choose how they would pursue their targets and what methods they would use. While many bounty hunters adhered to a personal moral code, others took advantage of their autonomy, resorting to brutality, deception, and intimidation when necessary. There were no institutional checks to ensure that their actions were just, and the absence of regulation allowed bounty hunters to make morally questionable decisions. In the absence of rules, the line between justice and exploitation was often blurred, making bounty hunters both powerful and dangerous figures in medieval society. Lack of accountability and the risk of abuse. The primary issue with the freedom that bounty hunters enjoyed was the lack of accountability. While law enforcement officers in modern times are bound by legal procedures and must answer to a higher authority, bounty hunters operated outside such systems. They were answerable only to their employer, who could be a lord, a monarch, or even a wealthy individual offering a reward. The bounty hunter's job was to capture or kill criminals, and once that task was complete, there were typically no questions asked about how it was accomplished. Without a formal legal structure to regulate their actions, bounty hunters were free to use any means necessary to achieve their goal. If a bounty hunter felt that violence, coercion, or deception would bring quicker results, they could use these tactics without fear of reprisal. For example, a bounty hunter might resort to torture to extract information from a criminal or potential witness, or they might fabricate evidence to ensure successful capture. While some bounty hunters adhered to a sense of honor or fairness, many were driven purely by the financial reward and saw the criminal as an obstacle to be overcome by any means necessary. This lack of oversight created an environment where excessive force or unethical tactics were sometimes justified in the pursuit of a bounty. The lack of accountability also meant that corruption was a real danger in the profession. Bounty hunters could easily be manipulated by the wealthy or powerful, taking contracts that furthered the personal agendas of their employers. For example, a bounty hunter hired to capture a criminal might unknowingly or knowingly target an individual who was politically inconvenient for a noble or ruler, even if the person had not actually committed a crime. In such cases, the bounty hunter would not be pursuing justice, but rather acting as a tool for the powerful, capturing enemies on behalf of those with the resources to hire them. This blurred the line between justice and self-interest, as bounty hunters who were motivated by greed might end up serving a corrupt system that used them as agents of oppression. The corruption of power and the moral dilemma. For many bounty hunters, the promise of wealth and status was a key motivator in their work. The more dangerous or high-profile the criminal, the higher the bounty and the greater the reward. This financial incentive was central to the appeal of bounty hunting, and it often led bounty hunters to make moral compromises in pursuit of the reward. While some bounty hunters pursued criminals for greater good, believing that their actions were restoring order, others saw the job purely as a way to line their pockets. In such cases, personal gain overshadowed the pursuit of justice, leading bounty hunters to take contracts for criminals who were not necessarily deserving of punishment. One of the greatest moral dilemmas for bounty hunters was a question of whether they were truly pursuing justice or simply seeking to fulfill a personal desire for wealth and recognition. The medieval world was a place where social status and power were determined largely by wealth and land, and bounty hunters who succeeded in capturing dangerous criminals were often rewarded with both. This meant that the line between morally justified action and personal ambition could be very thin. In the case of political criminals or rebels, bounty hunters were sometimes hired by rulers to capture individuals who were seen as threats to the power structure. These criminals, though labeled as outlaws or traitors by the ruling elite, might have been individuals who simply opposed the prevailing social order. For a bounty hunter, capturing such individuals might mean gaining favor with powerful figures, but also meant supporting a system that valued power over fairness. The freedom to decide how to act also meant that bounty hunters were often the arbiters of justice in their own right. They could decide the fate of the criminals they pursued, choosing whether to capture or kill, or let them go based on their own beliefs, motivations, and the circumstances of the hunt. While many bounty hunters followed the rule of law, others made decisions based on personal ethics or convenience. In some cases, bounty hunters acted with the intention of serving the greater good, while in others, they pursued criminals to satisfy personal vendettas or political agendas. The ambiguity of their profession made it difficult to categorize bounty hunters as either heroes or villains, as their actions could vary significantly depending on the individual and the situation. Moral justifications and personal codes. Some bounty hunters adhered to a personal code of ethics, believing that they were bringing criminals to justice and that their actions, however violent, were justified by the greater good. They saw themselves as agents of order, doing what the law could not in an age where justice was often slow, inefficient, or selectively enforced. For these bounty hunters, capturing criminals was not just a job. It was a calling, a responsibility to society. They operated under the belief that they were protecting the weak and ensuring that criminals face the consequences of their actions. In their eyes, the rewards they received were a necessary part of the system, compensation for the risks and hardships they endured in their pursuit of justice. For others, however, the lack of oversight and accountability allowed for the corruption of personal values. Some bounty hunters operated purely for personal gain, seeking wealth and power rather than justice. These individuals were more akin to mercenaries than law enforcement officers, taking contracts for whoever could afford them, regardless of the morality of the target. In these cases, bounty hunting became a profession driven by self-interest, rather than a pursuit of justice for the greater good. Ultimately, the freedom to act without constraints made bounty hunters both essential and morally complicated figures. While some pursued criminals with honor, others used their independence to manipulate the system for personal gain. The lack of regulation allowed bounty hunters to act in ways that both enforced justice and undermined it, depending on the motivations of the individual. This moral flexibility meant that bounty hunters could easily slide from being agents of justice to mercenaries, making the profession one that was, at times, necessary and at others, morally suspect. Without oversight, the line between right and wrong became subjective, leaving bounty hunters to navigate the ethical complexities of their profession on their own terms. Medieval bounty hunters operated in an environment where the concept of justice was not always clear-cut. The profession itself was inherently ambiguous. Bounty hunters were hired to capture criminals, but in many cases, the very nature of their targets and the methods they used to apprehend them raised questions about the ethical foundations of their work. In a society where laws were often enforced inconsistently, and where power was frequently in the hands of select few, bounty hunters found themselves navigating a moral landscape where the boundaries between justice, revenge, and self-interest were often blurred. The task of capturing criminals, particularly those accused of political crimes or rebellion, often involved difficult decisions for bounty hunters. Was their mission to uphold the law, or was it more about serving the interests of the powerful? A criminal accused of treason, for example, might have been viewed by the ruling elite as a dangerous threat, but by others, they might be seen as a hero or a victim of an unjust system. Bounty hunters, free from the oversight of a formal legal system, had to decide whose version of justice they would pursue, and often that decision was influenced by the reward offered or the political motivations of the person who hired them. Justice, as defined by the powerful, In many cases, bounty hunters were hired by the elite, monarchs, nobles, or political leaders who had a vested interest in the capture of specific criminals. These individuals had the power to define who was a criminal and who was not, often based on their own political and social interests. For the bounty hunter, this meant that the concept of justice was not fixed but shaped by those with power. When hired by a ruler to capture a criminal, the bounty hunter might be chasing someone who had committed a political offense rather than a clear-cut crime. The line between right and wrong was often determined by the priorities of the person who paid for the hunt. For example, during periods of political unrest or rebellion, bounty hunters were frequently employed to hunt down rebels or traitors, figures who were viewed as enemies of the state by those in power. However, these same individuals could be seen as champions of freedom or as victims of tyranny by the people they represented. A bounty hunter's task was to capture or kill these individuals, but the question remained, was the bounty hunter serving justice, or was the hunt merely a tool of political repression? In many cases, bounty hunters did not ask such questions. They simply did what they were paid to do. The concept of justice was therefore fluid, and the moral value of their actions was shaped by the perspective of the powerful. The role of personal morality in decision-making. While bounty hunters were generally motivated by financial gain, the absence of formal oversight left room for them to make personal moral judgments about their actions. For some bounty hunters, the job was not just about collecting a reward, but about upholding a personal sense of justice. These individuals may have viewed themselves as avengers of wrongdoings, bringing criminals to account for their actions, regardless of the political context. Their decision-making, though independent, could be guided by a belief in right and wrong, making them more likely to pursue criminals whom they genuinely believed were deserving of punishment. On the other hand, bounty hunters who were less concerned with moral principles might have been motivated purely by self-interest. In these cases, the bounty hunter's actions were shaped by personal gain rather than any inherent sense of justice. Such hunters might have targeted individuals based not on their crimes, but on the bounty promised by their employer. For these individuals, the concept of justice was irrelevant. The reward was the only thing that mattered. This lack of moral compass made it possible for bounty hunters to pursue innocent people, or at the very least, people who were wrongfully accused, if it meant claiming the reward. The gray area of legal and illegal actions. The blurred line between legal and illegal actions was another defining feature of the bounty hunter profession. In medieval society, where law enforcement was often patchy or non-existent, the role of a bounty hunter was to act as a kind of private justice, but without the constraints of the legal system. They were not law officers, and their actions often went unchecked by the courts. As a result, bounty hunters could resort to questionable tactics without fear of reprisal. They could use violence, coercion, or deception to achieve their goal of capturing criminals. There was no court to oversee their actions, no trial to determine if their methods were fair or legal. If a bounty hunter killed a criminal or tortured them for information, there was no system to hold them accountable, provided they successfully captured the target. This lack of legal scrutiny created a moral gray area where the means often justified the ends. Bounty hunters, especially those who were driven purely by reward, might see no issue in resorting to torture or deception in order to capture their prey. In the absence of rules, the line between justifiable force and excessive violence was blurred, and bounty hunters could define what was acceptable in their pursuit of criminals. This autonomy meant that what constituted justice was largely up to the bounty hunter's discretion. The ability to define and act on their own sense of justice or revenge meant that bounty hunters were often both respected and feared. They were crucial to maintaining order in areas where traditional law enforcement was absent, but their moral flexibility made them dangerous and unpredictable. The fact that they were free to pursue criminals without formal restrictions meant that they were capable of great acts of justice, but also great acts of cruelty. This unpredictability made it difficult to assess whether the bounty hunter was acting in the best interest of society or serving the whims of the powerful. Consequences of moral ambiguity. The consequences of this moral ambiguity were far-reaching. For one, it led to a system in which justice could be manipulated based on the whims of the powerful. A bounty hunter might be hired to capture a criminal who had committed a political crime or a rebellion, but the true nature of the crime was not always clear. Was the criminal a traitor, or was he a martyr for a noble cause? In many cases, the bounty hunter had little interest in the political context and saw their role as a simple transaction: capture the criminal, collect the reward. In these cases, the bounty hunter's sense of justice was less about right and wrong and more about the opportunity for personal gain. This dynamic, where the bounty hunter was free to define justice according to their own motivations, often led to an unjust system where those with power could manipulate justice for their own purposes. The consequences of such actions could be far-reaching, with innocent people being captured or even executed for crimes they did not commit. The lack of oversight made it possible for the powerful to use bounty hunters to eliminate political threats, punish dissenters, and crush opposition. In this way, bounty hunters became instruments of control, serving the interests of the ruling elite rather than the cause of justice. Ultimately, the profession of bounty hunting in the medieval period was one of moral complexity. The absence of ethical oversight, the financial rewards, and the ability to define justice on their own terms made bounty hunters both essential to maintaining order and dangerously unpredictable. The line between justice and oppression was often blurred, and the bounty hunters' actions, whether noble or corrupt, were a direct reflection of the world in which they operated. Medieval bounty hunters, unlike their modern counterparts, operated in a system with little to no regulation governing their actions, leading to a profession steeped in moral uncertainty. With few rules and no formal oversight, bounty hunters had the power to define justice on their own terms. This absence of regulation was both a blessing and a curse, as it allowed for great autonomy, but also opened the door to potential abuses of power, corruption, and excessive violence. The lack of an established legal framework meant that the way justice was pursued often depended on the bounty hunter's personal ethics, the instructions of the person who hired them, and the rewards offered for a successful capture. In many cases, this system allowed bounty hunters to make decisions that would otherwise be considered unlawful or immoral. Unregulated power and the potential for abuse. Without formal regulation, the power of bounty hunters could easily be abused. They were free agents, working for the highest bidder, without the constraints that modern law enforcement officers face. A bounty hunter could be hired to track down a criminal, but the lack of oversight meant that the methods they used could vary widely, depending on personal judgment and the circumstances. This autonomy meant that bounty hunters had the freedom to use force, deception, or even torture to achieve their goals. The absence of rules allowed them to act swiftly, but it also removed any checks on their actions, leaving room for excessive brutality. This lack of regulation was particularly problematic when bounty hunters were hired by powerful individuals or political figures with their own interests at stake. A noble, for example, could hire a bounty hunter to track down a political opponent or a rebellious serf. In such cases, the bounty hunter was not pursuing justice, but rather serving the will of the powerful. The fact that bounty hunters could act independently of the law meant that corruption was a constant risk. Bounty hunters could be easily manipulated or bribed, and many were willing to turn a blind eye to the ethics of their mission in exchange for greater rewards. In these instances, political power became the ultimate determinant of who was guilty, and the bounty hunter's role was reduced to that of a mercenary, carrying out the orders of the elite without question. Justice without oversight. Without formal legal oversight, bounty hunters could define what justice meant for themselves. For some, this meant acting as avengers of wrongs, capturing criminals for the sake of the greater good. But for others, the concept of justice was secondary to personal gain. A bounty hunter might pursue a criminal solely to collect a bounty, regardless of whether the person was truly guilty of the crime they were accused of. In a society where many were impoverished, the lure of financial rewards could be enough to override any concerns about the morality of the mission. For some bounty hunters, their actions were motivated by a sense of retribution, while for others, it was purely about the reward. When bounty hunters were tasked with capturing criminals who were not just common outlaws but political dissidents, rebels, or traitors, the ambiguity of justice was even more pronounced. For example, rebels who rose against a king or noble might have been seen as criminals by the ruling elite, but to the common people, they might have been viewed as freedom fighters. In these cases, the bounty hunter's role was no longer simply about capturing a criminal, but also about navigating the complex world of political allegiances. Were they serving justice by capturing these rebels, or were they doing the bidding of tyrants and those who sought to maintain their power? The bounty hunter, operated without legal constraints, had no clear answer. The effect on the justice system. The lack of regulation in bounty hunting not only made the profession morally ambiguous, but also undermined the justice system itself. In the absence of formal law enforcement, bounty hunters filled a void, but their actions were rarely subject to scrutiny. This system of private justice created a situation in which criminals could be apprehended without due process. While bounty hunters might have been effective in capturing dangerous criminals, they were not bound by the same legal principles that govern official law enforcement. As a result, the pursuit of justice was often arbitrary and subjective. This unregulated system was a far cry from the modern understanding of justice, where criminals are afforded legal protections, such as the right to a fair trial. In the medieval period, a bounty hunter could apprehend someone based on mere accusations, without evidence or legal proceedings. The lack of an established system for determining guilt meant that people were often punished without trial, either through arrest, execution, or exile. The absence of a clear legal framework for adjudicating these cases created an environment where accusations could easily turn into convictions and where criminals could be punished without any form of due process. Moreover, the system of bounty hunting placed immense power in the hands of a few individuals. In a society where power was concentrated in the hands of the elite, bounty hunters were often hired to act on behalf of those in power, enforcing the whims of the rich and powerful, rather than pursuing true justice. The freedom to act without accountability allowed for oppression to be carried out under the guise of law enforcement. Those with money and influence could hire bounty hunters to target their enemies, turning the profession into an instrument of political control. The ethical dilemma of accountability. The absence of accountability and the freedom to operate outside the law also presented an ethical dilemma for bounty hunters themselves. Some might believe they were pursuing justice, bringing criminals to account for their crimes, but others were simply interested in the reward. When the line between justice and personal gain became so blurred, it was difficult for bounty hunters to consistently act in an ethically sound manner. The decision to pursue a fugitive was often based on factors unrelated to the criminal's actual guilt, such as the bounty offered or the political motivations of those hiring the bounty hunter. For bounty hunters, the lack of legal regulation and moral oversight meant that they operated in a world where personal ethics became a determining factor in how they conducted their work. Without the guidance of an external system, bounty hunters were left to interpret justice according to their own standards. This often led to inconsistencies in their approach, with some acting with a sense of honor and others resorting to brutality or deception to achieve their goal. As a result, the profession was as much about the individual moral compass of the bounty hunter as it was about the act of capturing criminals. Chapter 7. The Legacy and Impact of Bounty Hunters. Medieval bounty hunters, despite operating in a time and system that lacked the legal frameworks we know today, left a lasting imprint on history, culture, and even modern-day law enforcement. Their presence in medieval society was driven by necessity. They filled the gaps left by slow or ineffective legal systems, and, in doing so, became key figures in maintaining order in otherwise lawless regions. The legacy of these figures has persisted over centuries, with their exploits shaping the way we understand justice, law enforcement, and even the concept of the private justice system. The work of medieval bounty hunters did not just fade into the pages of history as soon as their targets were captured. Their stories were passed down, woven into legends and immortalized in folklore. These individuals, operating in the shadows of formal law enforcement, became larger-than-life figures in the popular imagination. Tales of their daring exploits, filled with suspense, courage, and sometimes cruelty, were retold in various forms of art, literature, and theater. Over time, the figure of the bounty hunter evolved from a pragmatic lawman to an iconic character in Western folklore, inspiring books, movies, and even television shows that are popular to this day. The role in shaping popular culture. Medieval bounty hunters may not have had the luxury of the widespread documentation we have today, but their impact on popular culture is undeniable. Over time, their exploits, often exaggerated or dramatized, were romanticized and shaped the modern-day archetype of the bounty hunter, the lone vigilante who tracks down criminals for the right price. Western films, books, and television series, particularly from the 19th and 20th centuries, have drawn heavily on the idea of a hard-edged, morally ambiguous figure who exists outside the law to capture criminals. This portrayal, while often far removed from the realities of medieval bounty hunting, shows how the profession became ingrained in our cultural understanding of justice. Characters like the man with no name from classic spaghetti westerns or the bounty hunters of Star Wars carry echoes of their medieval predecessors. They operate as lone agents, whose skill and decisiveness often lead to the capture or demise of their targets. The archetype of the lone hunter, living by their wits and skill, indifferent to the formal systems of law and order, can be traced directly back to medieval bounty hunters who operated in the lawless corners of Europe. Whether it's the iconic Boba Fett, an intergalactic bounty hunter, or the modern interpretation of the bounty hunter in crime novels, these figures reflect a mythologized version of the medieval hunters who were willing to do what others could not or would not do. The romanticization of bounty hunters has also found its way into the modern entertainment landscape. While the real-world bounty hunter may have been a complex and morally ambiguous figure, the fictionalized versions often embody the tension between justice and lawlessness, reinforcing the idea of the outsider as a vehicle for resolving conflicts. These characters represent the deep-rooted cultural fascination with vigilantism, and in many ways, they owe their origins to the medieval bounty hunters, who similarly worked outside of the established legal frameworks of their time. Influence on modern law enforcement. The legacy of medieval bounty hunters also extends to the world of modern law enforcement. Although the system of bounty hunting as it existed in medieval times is no longer in widespread practice, some aspects of it are still alive today in various forms, particularly in the practice of bail bondsmen. In many countries, particularly in the United States, bail bondsmen act as a form of modern bounty hunters, tracking down those who have skipped bail and are trying to evade the law. The profession of bail enforcement or fugitive recovery, while regulated, mirrors many of the aspects of medieval bounty hunting, operates outside traditional police channels, often using similar tracking and apprehension techniques. Furthermore, bounty hunters in the medieval period also influence how we think about private individuals taking action in the face of failure by the state. In an age when local or national law enforcement might have been ineffective, the idea of a private individual stepping in to ensure justice was set a precedent for how we view citizen justice today. While the more extreme, unregulated methods of medieval bounty hunters are not reflected in modern legal systems, their legacy is visible in ways society grapples with questions of law, order, and justice, especially when state systems fail to act in time. The role of bounty hunters in medieval times also reflects a broader societal theme: the tension between the formal legal system and informal systems of justice. Bounty hunters often filled in gaps where the law was slow or where it was not capable of reaching. This parallel can be seen in contemporary discussions surrounding private security firms, citizens' arrest laws, and the increasing reliance on technology and surveillance in law enforcement. Just as medieval bounty hunters had to use their wit and resources to track down criminals, modern law enforcement agencies now use a mixture of private contractors, technology, and surveillance networks to accomplish similar goals. A legacy of moral ambiguity. While bounty hunters were often portrayed as heroes in medieval folklore, their legacy is also tied to the moral ambiguity of their profession. Many bounty hunters operated outside the law, making decisions about life and death without the checks and balances of a judicial system. This lack of regulation, though central to profession, also raised concerns about the fairness and justice of their actions. Were they heroes fighting for a greater good, or were they mercenaries motivated by greed? This fundamental moral question continues to be a central theme in modern depictions of bounty hunters in popular culture, from Western movies to science fiction sagas. In the end, the legacy of medieval bounty hunters is one of complexity. They were essential in maintaining order in a society that lacked reliable law enforcement, yet their methods and motivations were often questionable. The blurred lines between justice and self-interest, the autonomy they held, and the risks they took for rewards they earned shaped not only their reputation and history, but also how modern society views the intersection of law, morality, and private action. While their profession may have evolved, the core questions about ethics, justice, and authority that their work raised remain relevant even today. While medieval bounty hunters left a significant mark on culture, law enforcement, and even modern portrayals of justice, their impact was not entirely positive. The darker consequences of their profession stem from the lack of regulation, oversight, and ethical accountability, which led to the abuse of power, corruption, and the erosion of true justice. While some bounty hunters may have pursued their targets with honor and integrity, the absence of oversight meant that many exploited the system for personal gain, often with devastating effects on the very people they were supposed to serve. The exploitation of vulnerable individuals. One of the most troubling consequences of the lack of regulation was the way in which vulnerable individuals were often targeted by bounty hunters. In a medieval society marked by inequality, where the rich and powerful controlled most aspects of life, bounty hunters could be easily manipulated to capture individuals who were wrongfully accused or had committed minor offenses. Without the protections of a fair trial or a system of checks and balances, those who were poor, disenfranchised, or politically weak were often at the mercy of bounty hunters who had no obligation to ensure that justice was truly served. Bounty hunters were often employed by those in power, nobles, kings, or even church leaders, who were motivated by political, financial, or personal interests. When hired to capture a criminal, bounty hunters could pursue not only guilty individuals but also political enemies or social outcasts. As these individuals had fewer means to defend themselves, they were disproportionately affected by bounty hunters who sought financial gain at the expense of innocent people. This exploitation of vulnerable groups created an unbalanced system where justice was often defined by the bounty hunters' own motives and the whims of those who hired them. Injustice fueled by personal gain. Another significant negative impact of the unregulated profession was the potential for corruption. Since bounty hunters were primarily motivated by the reward offered for a successful capture, their actions were often driven by personal gain rather than a genuine desire for justice. This created an environment where bounty hunters could easily be bribed or manipulated by the powerful. The absence of any formal code of conduct meant that individuals with wealth or influence could use bounty hunters to settle personal scores, remove political opponents, or eliminate threats without the need for a trial or legal proceedings. In such instances, the bounty hunter was no longer an agent of justice, but rather a mercenary, willing to chase any target that would bring them monetary reward. This undermined the idea of fairness and due process, as bounty hunters could be convinced to track down anyone, regardless of whether they were truly deserving of punishment. The system created an avenue for the rich and powerful to use private individuals for their own purposes, resulting in oppression for the vulnerable, the risk of injustice, and arbitrary punishments. The lack of a formal legal framework meant that there was no oversight or accountability for the actions of bounty hunters. Without the requirement for a fair trial, the punishment meted out by bounty hunters was often arbitrary. A criminal could be sentenced to death or imprisonment based on the bounty hunter's personal judgment, rather than a legal verdict. This lack of due process meant that individuals who were merely accused of crimes could be punished without cause. Moreover, the physical brutality of bounty hunters who employed excessive force often resulted in innocent people suffering, even if they were eventually proven to be wrongly accused. The lack of standards in how criminals were treated also meant that the methods used by bounty hunters varied widely, depending on their individual attitudes and the reward offered. In some cases, bounty hunters resorted to violence, deception, and coercion as their primary tools to capture criminals. They could, and sometimes did, use whatever means necessary to complete the job, including torture to extract information or force confessions. This reliance on violent tactics meant that the punishment often did not fit the crime, and innocent individuals could easily be subjected to harsh, unjust treatment, a legacy of moral ambiguity and fear. Ultimately, the lack of oversight and accountability created a moral vacuum in the bounty hunting profession, where right and wrong were defined not by a consistent legal system, but by the personal interests and ethical standards of each individual bounty hunter. As a result, moral ambiguity became a defining feature of the profession. While some bounty hunters were driven by a sense of justice, many others were motivated by greed, and this created a profession where the line between right and wrong was often hard to discern. The fear that bounty hunters could instill in the population, coupled with a lack of fairness in the system, made medieval society an even more dangerous place for those who were already vulnerable. The dark side of bounty hunting was not just the violence or potential for exploitation, but the systemic abuse of a legal system that allowed the powerful to use bounty hunters to maintain control and suppress dissent. Although the medieval practice of bounty hunting has largely faded from the mainstream, its impact on the modern criminal justice system and law enforcement remains significant. The autonomy and methods employed by medieval bounty hunters helped shape many of the principles and practices we recognize today in modern law enforcement. While bounty hunting as a profession is not as widespread as it once was, the concept of fugitive recovery and the continuing practice of bail enforcement share a direct link to the medieval hunters who tracked down criminals for a reward. The concept of individuals being hired to capture criminals for monetary rewards laid the foundation for the bounty hunting system that we see in some countries today. In places like the United States, the practice of bounty hunting persists in the form of bail bondsmen and fugitive recovery agents. These modern-day bounty hunters, much like their medieval counterparts, track down fugitives who fail to appear in court after posting bail. Though today's bounty hunters operate within a much more regulated legal framework, the autonomy and the reward-based compensation structure closely mirror the practices of the medieval period, where bounty hunters operate outside the official justice system, motivated by both duty and financial gain. Influence on modern fugitive recovery systems. The modern bail bond system was largely shaped by the practices established by medieval bounty hunters. In the medieval period, individuals who have been accused of crimes could sometimes purchase their freedom with a bail payment. However, this was an imperfect system, and bounty hunters often served as the means of ensuring that those who had skipped bail were brought back into custody. This system gradually evolved into the bail bond system, where bail bondsmen would assume financial responsibility for a defendant in exchange for a fee. If the defendant fails to appear in court, the bondman hires a fugitive recovery agent, more commonly known as a bounty hunter, to track down and apprehend the individual. In this way, the autonomous role of medieval bounty hunters was preserved, albeit in a more regulated context. These modern bounty hunters still operate independently of police forces, often relying on their own methods of tracking and apprehending suspects. While they are legally required to follow certain rules and are subject to state and federal laws, the broad freedom they enjoy in pursuing fugitives without needing approval from authorities is a direct inheritance from the medieval bounty hunting tradition. The reward-driven model continues to ensure that bounty hunters have a vested interest in ensuring that fugitives are captured swiftly, mirroring the incentives that motivated bounty hunters in the past. Continuing themes of autonomy and moral dilemmas. One key element that has endured through both medieval and modern bounty hunting is the autonomy granted to those who operate within this field. Like medieval bounty hunters, modern bounty hunters often work independently, with limited oversight or involvement from law enforcement. While law enforcement can request help or cooperate with bounty hunters, it is not their primary role to supervise their actions. This autonomy raises the same moral dilemmas that were present in medieval times. Bounty hunters today still face situations where the distinction between justice and self-interest is unclear. The high rewards for capturing a fugitive can lead to decisions based on financial incentives, sometimes at the expense of ethical considerations. This continuity from the past speaks to the ambiguity that still exists in the role of a bounty hunter. Are they serving justice or merely chasing a paycheck? Moreover, the role of modern bounty hunters often involves a personal code of conduct, just as medieval hunters navigated the ethical terrain of their profession. Some bounty hunters today adhere to strict codes of conduct, believing their work is essential to the legal system, while others take a more flexible approach, operating in a gray area where profit sometimes outweighs the pursuit of justice. This echoes a medieval bounty hunter's reliance on their own moral compass to justify their methods and decisions. The legacy of private justice. Finally, the legacy of medieval bounty hunters has had a broader impact on the way society views private justice. The idea that individuals, rather than the state, can take matters into their own hands to enforce laws has persisted for centuries. In modern times, this concept still resonates in discussions about vigilantism, self-defense, and private security. While bounty hunting itself has become more regulated, the broader question of whether individuals or private agents can seek justice outside of state control continues to be a point of contention. In conclusion, the lasting influence of medieval bounty hunters is evident in the systems of law enforcement and justice we have today. Their autonomy, reward-driven motivation, and role in tracking down fugitives laid the groundwork for modern practices in fugitive recovery and private justice. Though the world has changed significantly since the medieval period, the moral complexities and ethical challenges faced by bounty hunters are as relevant now as they were centuries ago. The legacy of the medieval bounty hunter remains embedded in both legal systems and popular culture, continuing to provoke thought about justice, power, and the fine line between law enforcement and personal gain. In conclusion, medieval bounty hunters played a crucial and often morally ambiguous role in the justice systems of their time. Operating with significant autonomy and limited oversight, they bridged the gap between ineffective legal systems and the need for order, capturing criminals for a reward. While their work was often driven by personal gain, the legacy of these figures has continued to influence modern law enforcement practices, particularly in the field of fugitive recovery. The autonomy and lack of regulation that defined their profession raised ethical questions that still resonate today, highlighting the complex relationship between justice, power, and personal responsibility. Despite the evolution of legal systems, the concept of private justice remains alive in modern society, with a legacy of medieval bounty hunters continuing to shape how we understand justice and its enforcement. Their stories, both heroic and troubling, remain integral to the cultural and legal landscape.